Hey there, wonderful viewers. If you're enjoying my content, please take a second to hit that like button. It really helps the YouTube algorithm show my videos to more people. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Now grab your favorite drink, sit back, relax, and let's dive into today's story. I promise it'll be worth your time. I drove out to the Adirondack wilderness in late October 2024. Seeking solitude after months of grueling work at the architectural firm. At 34, I had begun to feel the weight of urban life pressing down on me, and the mountains called with their promise of quiet contemplation. The spot I chose wasn't marked on any trail map, just a secluded clearing I'd discovered during a previous expedition. It lay nestled between ancient pines whose branches were adorned with the fiery colors of autumn, creating a natural sanctuary that seemed to exist outside of time. The drive from Albany took nearly 3 hours, with the last stretch navigated on dirt roads that grew increasingly narrow. My old Subaru complained as it bounced over exposed roots and rocks, but I pressed on, driven by an almost desperate need for isolation. Work had become suffocating. The constant deadlines and demanding clients had left me emotionally drained. This weekend represented more than a casual camping trip. It was an escape. Perhaps even a reclamation of myself. As I parked at the makeshift lot near an abandoned ranger station, I noticed how the temperature had dropped considerably. The forecast had predicted mild weather, but a biting chill permeated the air. I zipped my jacket higher and shouldered my pack, which contained everything I'd need for the next 3 days. Tent, sleeping bag, food supplies, and the bare essentials for survival. The weight felt reassuring against my back as I set off down the faint trail that would lead me to my destination. The forest welcomed me with a symphony of subtle sounds, leaves crunching underfoot, distant birdsong, and the occasional rustle of small animals darting through the underbrush. Sunlight filtered through the canopy in golden shafts, illuminating particles of dust that danced in the air. For the first time in months, I felt my breathing slow and my shoulders relax. The tensions of city life began to dissolve with each step deeper into the wilderness. After an hour of hiking, the trail narrowed further until it was barely discernible. Most hikers would have turned back, assuming they'd wandered off course, but I recognized the twisted oak that marked the final turn toward my private sanctuary. Ducking under low-hanging branches, I pushed through a dense thicket of bushes and emerged into the clearing. It appeared exactly as I remembered, a perfect oval of open space, perhaps 50 feet across, surrounded by towering trees that formed a natural barrier. The ground was carpeted with fallen leaves in various stages of decay, creating a rich tapestry of reds, browns, and golds. At the center, a ring of stones remained from my previous fire, untouched since my last visit. Home for the weekend, I murmured to myself, dropping my pack and stretching my arms overhead. The clearing seemed to respond with a gentle rustling of leaves, almost like a whisper of acknowledgement. I attributed the sound to a passing breeze, but something about it tickled the back of my mind. The air was completely still. I dismissed the thought and set about making camp with practiced efficiency. The tent went up quickly, secured against potential wind that the weather report hadn't mentioned. I gathered firewood from the perimeter of the clearing, careful not to venture too far into the surrounding forest as daylight began to wane. By the time I had a fire crackling in the stone ring, shadows had begun to lengthen across the ground, stretching like dark fingers toward my campsite. That first evening passed pleasantly enough. I heated a simple meal of dehydrated stew over the fire and savored it with a satisfaction that far outweighed its actual flavor. The isolation felt therapeutic, allowing my thoughts to wander freely without the constant interruptions of emails, calls, and meetings. As darkness settled completely, I leaned back against my pack and gazed upward at the emerging stars, visible through the circular opening in the canopy above. Yet despite the peacefulness, a subtle disquiet began to take root inside me. It wasn't anything tangible at first, just an awareness that the forest had grown unusually quiet. The nocturnal creatures that typically announce themselves after sunset remained silent. No owls hooted, no small mammals rustled in the undergrowth. Even the wind seemed to have abandoned this place, leaving an unnatural stillness that pressed against my eardrums like a physical force. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps a predator was passing through the area, causing the smaller creatures to hide. Or maybe the unusually cold weather had driven them to seek warmer shelter. Whatever the explanation, I couldn't shake the sensation of being observed, as though the darkness beyond my firelight concealed watchful eyes. Just nerves, I told myself firmly, stoking the fire higher. This is exactly what you came for, quiet and solitude. But as I finally retreated to my tent and zipped myself into my sleeping bag, I couldn't help but notice how the silence seemed to intensify rather than diminish. I lay awake for what felt like hours, straining to hear any sound that might break the oppressive quiet. Eventually, exhaustion overcame my unease, and I drifted into a dreamless sleep. I had no way of knowing that this would be the last peaceful night I would experience for a very long time. Morning arrived with deceptive normalcy. Sunlight filtered through the tent fabric, creating a warm orange glow that momentarily dispelled the lingering unease from the previous night. I stretched within the confines of my sleeping bag, muscles pleasantly sore from yesterday's hike. Outside, birds had resumed their calls, their cheerful notes suggesting that whatever had silenced them the night before had passed. I emerged from the tent to find the clearing bathed in golden light. Dew sparkled on fallen leaves, and tendrils of mist rose from the ground like ghostly fingers reaching for the sky. The scene was picturesque, almost too perfect, like a carefully composed photograph rather than a natural wilderness setting. I shook off the thought and set about preparing breakfast. As I kindled a small fire and set water to boil for coffee, I found my attention repeatedly drawn to the tree line. Something felt different about the forest today, though I couldn't articulate exactly what had changed. The trees seemed to stand more rigidly, their trunks darker against the morning light. Shadows pooled more deeply between them, creating pockets of blackness that the sun couldn't penetrate. "You're being ridiculous," I muttered to myself, focusing on measuring coffee grounds into my portable press. "This is the same clearing you visited last year." Yet even as I spoke the words aloud, I knew they weren't entirely true. The physical features remained identical: the arrangement of trees, the composition of the ground, the shape of the clearing itself. But something ineffable had shifted, as though the forest had somehow become more aware of my presence overnight. My coffee tasted bitter despite the careful preparation, and the granola I'd brought suddenly seemed unappetizing. I forced myself to eat anyway, knowing I'd need the energy for the day's planned hike. According to my original itinerary, I would explore some of the surrounding ridges today, perhaps find a vantage point to photograph the autumn foliage in its full glory. Instead, I found myself procrastinating. I repacked my backpack multiple times, reorganized supplies that didn't need reorganizing, and spent an inordinate amount of time adjusting the guy lines on my tent. All the while, my eyes continued to drift toward the edge of the clearing, searching for something I couldn't name. By mid-morning, the delay had become absurd. Disgusted with my inexplicable hesitation, I forced myself to shoulder my day pack and approach the tree line. The forest trail I'd planned to follow was barely visible, a slight depression in the ground marked occasionally by broken twigs and disturbed leaves. As I reached the edge of the clearing, I paused, one foot poised to cross the threshold between open space and dense woods. A wave of dread washed over me, so intense it momentarily stole my breath. Every instinct screamed at me to retreat, to return to my tent, to pack up and leave this place immediately. The feeling was primitive and overwhelming, the ancient warning system buried deep in human DNA, designed to prevent our ancestors from wandering into predators' territories. I almost obeyed this primal urging. My foot hovered, ready to step backward rather than forward, but then a surge of anger cut through the fear. I was a rational adult, not a superstitious child. The forest was just a forest, trees and earth and wildlife, nothing more. With deliberate defiance, I stepped across the invisible boundary and entered the woods. The change was immediate and disorienting. The temperature dropped several degrees, and the quality of light shifted from golden warmth to a diffuse grayish illumination that seemed to leach color from my surroundings. Sounds became muffled, as though the air itself had thickened. Most disturbing was the sensation of crossing a threshold that shouldn't have existed, like moving from one reality into another with just a single step. I stood motionless, fighting the urge to retreat. My heart hammered against my ribs and sweat beaded on my forehead despite the cool air. Logic insisted that nothing had changed except my perception. affected perhaps by lack of sleep or the unfamiliar silence of the previous night. Yet every sense told me otherwise. "This is absurd," I said aloud, my voice sounding flat and lifeless in the dense air. "It's just the forest." I forced myself to move forward, following what remained of the trail. Each step required conscious effort, as though I were wading through invisible resistance. The trees seemed to press closer, their trunks gnarled and twisted in ways I hadn't noticed before. Branches reached overhead, interlacing to form a canopy that blocked most of the sky from view. Time behaved strangely as I walked. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Yet when I checked my watch, barely 20 minutes had passed since I'd left the clearing. The trail grew fainter until it disappeared altogether, leaving me to navigate by instinct through increasingly dense undergrowth. I should have turned back then. In retrospect, that moment, when the last vestige of human passage vanished beneath my feet, was my final opportunity to retreat safely. Instead, driven by stubborn determination and a growing fascination with the forest's oppressive atmosphere, I pressed onward. The trees began to change character as I ventured deeper. Their bark darkened to an almost black hue, and their shapes became more uniform, as though they had been deliberately planted in rows that only became apparent from certain angles. Moss grew thick on the northern sides of their trunks, but it was an unnatural shade of green, too vibrant, almost luminous in the dim light. After what my watch claimed was 45 minutes of hiking, I emerged into a small break in the trees. It wasn't a clearing so much as a slight thinning of the forest, creating a space perhaps 15 feet in diameter. I stopped, grateful for the marginally improved visibility, and took a sip from my water bottle. That's when I saw it. Lying on the ground, partially covered by fallen leaves, was a rectangular object approximately 4 feet long and 2 feet wide. At first glance, it resembled a fallen headstone, the kind found in old cemeteries. But as I approached cautiously, I realized this was something altogether different. The object was made of a material I couldn't immediately identify, not stone or metal or wood, but something that combined properties of all three. Its surface was perfectly smooth, with a subtle iridescence that shifted colors as I changed viewing angles. Most striking was its pristine condition. Despite lying on the forest floor, not a single leaf adhered to its surface, and no dirt marred its gleaming exterior. I knelt beside it, irrationally compelled to touch this anomalous object. My fingers hovered inches above its surface when a sound stopped me, a single sharp crack that echoed through the forest like a gunshot. I jerked upright, scanning my surroundings for the source of the noise. Nothing moved. The forest remained as still and silent as a photograph. But something fundamental had changed in that instant, a shift so profound that it took me several moments to identify what was different. The light had changed. When I'd knelt beside the object, midday sunlight had filtered through the canopy. Now, long shadows stretched across the ground, and the quality of light had transformed to the golden red of late afternoon. I glanced at my watch in confusion. 47 p.m. That couldn't be right. It had been barely past noon when I'd discovered the object. I tapped the watch face, certain it had malfunctioned, but the digital display remained stubbornly unchanged. Somehow, nearly 5 hours had vanished while I knelt beside the rectangular anomaly. I looked down, intending to examine the object again, but it was gone. In its place was nothing but undisturbed forest floor, covered in the same pattern of leaves and twigs that surrounded it. No indentation in the soil, no sign that anything had ever rested there. Panic surged through me, sharp and electric. I spun in a circle, disoriented and suddenly uncertain which direction I had come from. The trees looked identical in every direction, their dark trunks forming a confusing maze that offered no clues about my path. "This isn't happening," I whispered, my voice trembling. This can't be happening. But it was. Whatever rational explanations I might have constructed, hallucination, exhaustion, a miniature stroke affecting my perception of time, none could account for the overwhelming reality of my situation. I was lost in a forest that no longer behaved according to natural laws, with darkness approaching rapidly. Forcing myself to remain calm, I reached for the compass in my pack. The needle spun wildly, rotating in complete circles rather than settling on magnetic north. My phone showed no signal, and the GPS function displayed an error message I'd never seen before. With no better option, I chose a direction that felt right and began walking briskly, hoping to find my clearing before night fell completely. Each step filled me with increasing dread, as though I were moving deeper into danger rather than toward safety. The forest seemed to respond to my fear, growing darker and more oppressive around me. Just as despair threatened to overwhelm me, I glimpsed a flash of red through the trees. My tent. Relief flooded through me as I stumbled forward, emerging from the forest into my clearing with the desperate gratitude of a drowning person breaking the water's surface. But even this relief was short-lived. As I stood at the edge of the clearing, trying to slow my racing heart, I became aware of subtle changes to my campsite. The arrangement was exactly as I'd left it, but everything seemed slightly wrong. The color of my tent a shade darker than I remembered. The stones around my fire pit arranged in a pattern I didn't recall creating. Most disturbing was the fire itself. I had extinguished it completely before leaving for my hike. Yet now flames danced merrily in the stone circle, consuming logs I hadn't placed there. Someone or something had been in my camp while I was gone. The realization that my campsite had been disturbed sent ice through my veins. I stood frozen at the edge of the clearing, scanning for any sign of an intruder. The fire crackled innocently, casting dancing shadows across the ground, but the clearing appeared empty of human presence. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding thin and vulnerable in the open space. "Is anyone there?" No response came except the soft popping of burning wood. I took a tentative step forward, then another, moving cautiously toward my tent. Everything looked intact, no signs of damage or theft, but the wrongness persisted. It was as though someone had dismantled my entire campsite and reassembled it with painstaking precision, yet slightly off in ways too subtle to immediately identify. I approached the fire, studying the arrangement of logs. They were stacked in a distinctive crosshatch pattern I never used, creating a structure that burned efficiently but wasn't my style. The stones surrounding the pit had been rearranged into a perfect circle, each one equidistant from its neighbors with a precision that seemed impossible to achieve without measuring tools. My tent zipper was closed, exactly as I'd left it, but the rainfly had been adjusted, pulled tighter and secured with knots I didn't recognize. My backpack leaned against a nearby tree, apparently untouched, yet when I examined it closely, I found the contents reorganized, not ransacked or stolen, but arranged with unnerving orderliness. "This doesn't make any sense," I muttered, running a hand through my hair. The most rational explanation was that another hiker had found my campsite and decided to be helpful, starting a fire for my return, tidying up a bit. But that didn't explain the missing hours in the forest or the strange rectangular object that had vanished before my eyes. And it certainly didn't account for the profound sense of wrongness that permeated everything around me. As I stood contemplating these impossibilities, the sun slipped below the tree line, plunging the clearing into twilight. The fire's importance suddenly increased as darkness gathered beneath the surrounding trees. I added more wood to the flames, grateful for the light and warmth despite not having built the fire myself. The prospect of spending another night here filled me with dread, but I had little choice. Attempting to hike out in darkness would be foolhardy, especially given my earlier disorientation. My best option was to wait until morning, then pack up and leave this place as quickly as possible. With darkness came a deepening of the forest's silence, not the natural quiet of wilderness at night with its subtle symphony of insects and nocturnal creatures, but a profound absence of sound that felt deliberate and watchful. The fire's crackling seemed unnaturally loud against this backdrop, each pop and hiss startling in the stillness. I heated water for a dinner of dehydrated pasta, going through the motions mechanically while my mind raced. The food tasted like nothing, and I had to force myself to swallow each bite, knowing I needed sustenance for tomorrow's hike out. As I ate, my eyes constantly scanned the tree line, searching for movement or shapes that didn't belong. Occasionally I thought I glimpsed something, a darker patch of shadow that shifted independently, or a momentary reflection of light where no reflective surface should exist. But each time I focused directly on these anomalies, they vanished, leaving me uncertain whether they had ever existed outside my increasingly paranoid imagination. By the time I finished eating, full darkness had fallen. The fire illuminated only a small circle of ground, beyond which lay impenetrable blackness. The stars overhead seemed dimmer than they should have been, as though viewed through a filter, and the moon, which should have been nearly full according to my mental calendar, was nowhere to be seen. I considered staying awake all night, keeping watch by the fire until dawn, provided enough light to escape, but exhaustion pulled at me, a bone-deep weariness that seemed disproportionate to the day's physical exertion. My eyelids grew heavy despite my fear, and I realized that fighting sleep would only leave me too depleted to hike effectively tomorrow. With profound reluctance, I banked the fire to last as long as possible and retreated to my tent. Inside, I left my boots on and placed my packed backpack by the door, ready for a quick departure if necessary. My flashlight remained clutched in my hand as I lay down, its beam illuminating the tent's ceiling. Sleep seemed impossible in my state of heightened alertness, yet it crept up on me unexpectedly. One moment I was staring at the play of shadows on nylon fabric. The next I was drifting into uneasy unconsciousness, the flashlight still gripped in my fingers. I awoke to complete darkness. The flashlight had died, its batteries drained despite being new. Outside, the fire had extinguished completely, leaving not even a glow of embers. I fumbled for my phone to check the time, but it too had died, despite showing a nearly full charge earlier. Then I heard it, the sound that had likely awakened me. A low, rhythmic rumbling emanated from somewhere outside the tent. It resembled snoring, but with a depth and resonance that no human throat could produce. The sound rose and fell in a regular pattern, interspersed with a wet sliding noise that made my skin crawl. I lay perfectly still, barely breathing, as the sound moved around the perimeter of my tent. It would approach from one direction, growing louder until it seemed just inches from the thin nylon wall, then recede and circle around to approach from another angle. The movement wasn't continuous but happened in discrete jumps, as though whatever made the noise was teleporting rather than walking. My heart pounded so violently I feared it might be audible. Sweat soaked my clothes despite the cold night air, and my muscles cramped from the effort of remaining motionless. The darkness felt alive, pressing against the tent walls with palpable weight. The rumbling stopped abruptly, replaced by absolute silence. This proved even more terrifying than the noise. At least the sound had allowed me to track the thing's location. Now I had no idea where it was or what it might be doing. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as I strained to hear any indication of the entity's presence. Just as I began to hope it had departed, a new sound broke the silence, a slow, deliberate scratching directly above my head, on the roof of the tent. I bit back a scream, pressing a fist against my mouth. The scratching continued, methodical and unhurried, moving in patterns that almost suggested writing or symbols being traced. It continued for what my terror-stretched perception registered as an eternity, though it may have been only minutes. Then, without warning, a tremendous pressure descended on the tent, compressing the space around me. The walls bowed inward as though some enormous weight had settled atop the structure. The nylon fabric strained but remarkably didn't tear. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, trapped in a collapsing pocket of air as the unseen presence pressed down from above. Just when I thought I would suffocate, the pressure vanished. The tent walls snapped back to their normal position with an audible whoosh of displaced air. The scratching had stopped and the rumbling sound had resumed, but now it came from all directions simultaneously, surrounding the tent in a cylinder of noise. I lay there, paralyzed by fear, as the rumbling gradually faded over the next hour. Eventually, a faint lightening of the darkness inside the tent indicated approaching dawn. I had survived the night, though I couldn't comprehend how or why. When enough light filtered through the fabric to see by, I unzipped the tent with trembling hands and peered outside. The clearing appeared normal in the gray early morning light. No footprints around my tent, no signs of disturbance to the ground or surrounding vegetation. The only evidence that anything unusual had occurred was a series of marks on the tent's rainfly. I exited fully and circled the structure, examining these markings with growing horror. They formed no pattern I recognized, not letters or numbers or any human symbol system. Instead, they resembled the tracks left by snails or slugs, but vastly larger and arranged with deliberate precision. The marks glistened in the dawn light, still wet with some clear viscous substance that I refused to touch. Whatever had visited in the night, it wasn't human. And it had left me a message I couldn't begin to decipher. I broke camp with frantic efficiency, tearing down my tent without bothering to fold it properly and stuffing equipment haphazardly into my backpack. The strange markings on the rainfly seemed to writhe in my peripheral vision, though they remained static when viewed directly. I couldn't bear to pack the tent normally, touching those glistening trails as little as possible as I crammed the nylon into its stuff sack. The morning was unnaturally still. No breeze stirred the leaves, no birds called from the surrounding trees. Even the ambient sounds of a forest waking, rustling undergrowth, distant animal movements were conspicuously absent. The silence pressed against my eardrums like a physical force, broken only by my own rapid breathing and the rustle of equipment as I packed. I didn't bother with breakfast or coffee, despite knowing the energy would help for the hike ahead. Every instinct urged immediate departure. Overwhelming considerations of preparation or sustenance. Whatever had visited in the night might return, and I was determined to be far away when it did. With my pack secured, I faced the difficult question of which direction to take. The trail I'd followed into this clearing 2 days ago now seemed impossible to locate. The forest's edge presented an unbroken wall of vegetation, with no obvious path through the dense undergrowth. I circled the clearing 3 times, growing increasingly desperate as I searched for any sign of the route I'd originally taken. "This is impossible," I muttered, an edge of hysteria creeping into my voice. The trail can't just disappear. But it had. Or rather, it had been replaced by something else. A subtle alteration to the forest's configuration that erased familiar landmarks and pathways. I was reminded of stories about fairy rings and people led astray by malevolent spirits, tales I'd always dismissed as superstitious nonsense. Now, they seemed disturbingly plausible. With no better option, I chose the direction that seemed most likely based on the sun's position and plunged into the woods. The resistance was immediate. Branches that hadn't been there yesterday snagged my clothing. Roots emerged from the soil to trip my feet, and the ground itself seemed to tilt subtly uphill regardless of which way I turned. I persevered, pushing through the increasingly hostile terrain with grim determination. My direction became a zigzagging compromise between the path of least resistance and my intended route. Thorny vines appeared with suspicious frequency, forcing detours that gradually led me away from my original heading. After an hour of exhausting progress, I stopped to catch my breath and check my bearings. The forest had changed character again, becoming darker and more primeval. Trees here were massive, their trunks wider than any I'd seen in this region before. Their bark blackened as though by ancient fire. The canopy overhead had thickened to near opacity, allowing only occasional shafts of greenish light to penetrate to the forest floor. I reached for my compass, though I had little hope it would function normally. To my surprise, the needle settled in one direction, pointing steadily what I assumed was north. Hope flickered briefly. Perhaps whatever anomaly had affected this place was localized to the clearing and its immediate surroundings. Perhaps I had pushed through to normal forest again. That hope died as I studied my surroundings more carefully. The trees, while massive, were arranged with geometric precision, their trunks forming perfect rows when viewed from certain angles, creating the unsettling impression of a deliberately constructed environment, rather than natural growth. The forest floor was too uniform, covered in a layer of dark, damp leaves that showed no signs of animal disturbance. Most disturbing was the quality of sound. My breathing, the rustle of my clothing, the crunch of leaves beneath my boots, all seemed muffled and distant as though reaching my ears through water or thick glass. When I snapped a twig deliberately, the crack was delayed by several seconds, the sound arriving like an echo of an action long completed. I pressed on, using the compass as a guide despite growing suspicion of its reliability. The terrain gradually sloped downward, leading me into a shallow valley where the trees thinned slightly. For a moment, this seemed promising. Perhaps I was approaching the edge of this aberrant section of forest. Then I saw them. Arranged in a loose semicircle about 50 yards ahead were 5 rectangular objects identical to the one I'd encountered the previous day. They stood upright rather than lying flat, embedded in the earth like monoliths. Their surfaces caught what little light filtered through the canopy, reflecting it with the same iridescent quality I remembered. I froze, instinctively ducking behind a tree trunk. Every nerve in my body screamed danger, urging retreat. Yet I remained rooted in place, unable to tear my gaze from the impossible arrangement before me. As I watched, a subtle vibration began to emanate from the objects. It wasn't sound so much as a trembling of the air itself, a disturbance that rippled outward and made my teeth ache and vision blur. The space between the rectangular monoliths seemed to warp and flex, as though the very fabric of reality was being stretched thin. A gap appeared, not an opening between trees or a clearing in the forest, but a literal tear in space, revealing something beyond that my mind couldn't properly process. I glimpsed shapes and colors that seemed to fold in on themselves, geometries that couldn't exist in three-dimensional space, movement that occurred simultaneously in multiple contradictory directions. From this impossible aperture emerged a sound, the same rumbling, snoring noise that had circled my tent in the night. But now it carried harmonics and undertones that conveyed meaning, a language composed of vibrations rather than words. I couldn't understand it in any conventional sense, yet some primal part of my brain recognized it as communication. The gap widened, and something began to emerge. I didn't stay to see what it was. Pure animal terror finally broke my paralysis, sending me scrambling backward, and then into a full panicked run away from the monoliths and whatever was coming through that tear in reality. I abandoned any pretense of following a path, simply crashing through undergrowth in the opposite direction, heedless of the branches that whipped my face and tore at my clothing. Behind me, the vibration intensified, resonating through the ground and trees. The rumbling vocalization changed pitch, taking on a quality that unmistakably conveyed pursuit. Whatever had begun to emerge from that impossible doorway was now following me. I ran with the desperate energy of pure fear, my pack bouncing painfully against my back, my lungs burning as I gasped for breath. The forest blurred around me, trees becoming smears of darkness against which I constantly collided. Direction no longer mattered, only distance from the horror behind me. How long I ran I cannot say with certainty. Time had become as unreliable as everything else in this nightmare place. It might have been minutes or hours before I realized the nature of my pursuer had changed. The vibration through the ground had ceased, replaced by something more conventional. The sound of something large moving through the forest behind me, breaking branches and disturbing leaves with physical presence rather than reality-warping power. This shift from supernatural to natural pursuit should have been reassuring. Instead, it filled me with fresh terror. Whatever had emerged from that gap had fully materialized in this world now, solid enough to interact with the environment as it tracked me through the woods. My strength was failing, my initial burst of adrenaline long since exhausted. Each step became an act of will, my muscles burning with fatigue. I knew I couldn't maintain this pace much longer, yet slowing meant capture by whatever stalked me from behind. As despair threatened to overwhelm me, I glimpsed sunlight ahead, bright, normal sunlight streaming through a break in the trees. With my last reserves of energy, I pushed toward this promise of escape, bursting through a tangle of undergrowth into a small clearing. Relief washed over me as I recognized where I was, the parking area where I'd left my car 2 days ago. Somehow, my blind flight had led me back to civilization, to safety. My vehicle sat exactly where I'd left it, dusty but blessedly normal and real. I fumbled for my keys with trembling hands, unlocked the door, and threw myself inside. The engine started immediately, its familiar rumble the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard. I backed out of the space, tires spitting gravel, and accelerated down the dirt road toward the highway. In my rearview mirror, I caught a final glimpse of the forest's edge. Something moved in the shadows there, something tall and oddly shaped, its form suggesting humanoid dimensions, but wrong in fundamental ways I couldn't articulate. It didn't pursue me onto the road, but remained at the tree line, watching as I fled. I drove without stopping for nearly 3 hours, putting as much distance as possible between myself and those woods. Only when my gas gauge approached empty did I pull into a service station, hands still shaking as I refueled. The attendant gave me an odd look. No wonder, given my disheveled appearance, torn clothing, and wild eyes. "Rough camping trip?" he asked as I paid. "You could say that," I replied, my voice hoarse from exertion and screaming I didn't remember doing. "Where'd you go? Looks like you tangled with a bear." I hesitated, suddenly uncertain how to describe where I'd been. The name of the forest area seemed to have vanished from my memory, replaced by a blank space I couldn't fill. "Just some woods up north," I said finally. "I won't be going back." He nodded, clearly sensing my reluctance to elaborate. "Some places aren't meant for people to stay long. That's what my grandfather always said." His words sent a chill through me, striking uncomfortably close to what I'd experienced. I mumbled a response and returned to my car, eager to complete my journey home and put this nightmare behind me. But as I pulled back onto the highway, I glanced at my backpack on the passenger seat and noticed something that hadn't been there before. A small, wet smear on the fabric, glistening with the same iridescent quality as the marks on my tent. Whatever had pursued me through those woods had touched my belongings, and perhaps in some way I didn't yet understand, it had touched me as well. The return to my apartment should have felt like sanctuary. Instead, familiar surroundings only highlighted how profoundly I had changed. I moved through my evening routine mechanically, showering away forest grime, treating the numerous scratches on my arms and face, forcing down a simple meal I couldn't taste. My reflection in the bathroom mirror showed a stranger, hollow-eyed and gaunt, with a new wariness in my expression that hadn't existed 3 days ago. Sleep eluded me that first night home. Every creak of the building, every distant siren or car horn jarred me to alertness. I left lights burning in every room, unable to tolerate darkness that might conceal. What? I couldn't name what I feared might lurk in the shadows, yet the fear remained, visceral and undeniable. When exhaustion finally claimed me near dawn, my dreams were filled with geometric patterns that shifted and reconfigured themselves, forming doorways that opened onto impossible spaces. I woke gasping, sheets soaked with sweat, convinced for a moment that my bedroom ceiling had been replaced by a canopy of black trees. Monday arrived, and with it the expectation that I would return to work, resume normal life as though nothing extraordinary had occurred. I called in sick, unable to face the prospect of fluorescent lights and mundane conversations. My supervisor sounded concerned. I rarely took sick days, but accepted my hoarse explanation of a camping trip gone wrong. A severe cold contracted in the wilderness. That first day alone in my apartment became an exercise in hypervigilance. I found myself constantly checking windows and doors, ensuring they were locked and secure. Shadows in corners drew my attention with magnetic persistence. The irrational certainty that I was being observed never abated, forcing me to close blinds and curtains despite the beautiful autumn day outside. Most disturbing was my backpack, which I'd thrown into a corner upon returning home. The small glistening smear I'd noticed in the car had grown larger overnight, spreading across the fabric like a living organism. It retained its iridescent quality, shifting colors in different lighting, and seemed to pulse subtly when viewed from the corner of my eye. I should have destroyed the backpack immediately, burned it, perhaps, or at least discarded it in a dumpster far from my home. Instead, I found myself oddly reluctant to touch it again, as though doing so would acknowledge the reality of what had happened in those woods. So it remained in the corner, a tangible reminder that my experience had not been hallucination or delusion. By the third day, basic needs forced me outside. My refrigerator contained nothing but condiments and spoiled milk, and delivery services couldn't provide the prescription sleeping pills I'd convinced my doctor to call in. The world beyond my apartment door seemed simultaneously ordinary and threatening, people going about their business, oblivious to the horrors that existed in remote corners of wilderness, yet potentially harboring connections to those same horrors. At the pharmacy, the technician's fingers brushing mine as she handed over the medication made me flinch. The grocery store's fluorescent lighting hurt my eyes. Its normal sounds, beeping scanners, squeaking carts, indistinct conversations, amplified to near unbearable levels. I hurried through my errands, returning home with a profound sense of relief that quickly soured as I realized my apartment no longer felt safe either. The backpack had moved. Not dramatically, just a few inches from its original position, but enough to confirm my growing suspicion that whatever substance had marked it possessed agency and purpose. The smear had continued to spread, now covering nearly half the fabric and swirling iridescent patterns that resembled the markings I'd seen on my tent. I approached it cautiously, armed with a kitchen knife I knew would provide no real protection against the entity I'd encountered in the forest. The closer I got, the more the air around the backpack seemed to distort slightly, as though viewed through heat waves rising from hot asphalt. A faint vibration emanated from it, just at the threshold of hearing, the same resonant frequency I'd experienced near the monoliths. With trembling hands, I used the knife to drag the backpack into a plastic garbage bag, careful not to touch it directly. The material felt unnaturally heavy, as though it contained something far more substantial than camping gear. Once secured, I carried the bag to my bathtub, the only place in my apartment with a drain that might handle whatever came next. I should have sought help by this point. Called authorities, contacted university researchers, reached out to anyone with expertise that might explain what I'd encountered. But who would believe me? What evidence did I have beyond a contaminated backpack and my own increasingly unstable testimony? More likely I'd find myself under psychiatric evaluation rather than receiving meaningful assistance. So I acted alone, pouring bleach and drain cleaner over the backpack, hoping chemical corrosives might destroy whatever organism or substance had attached itself to my belongings. The reaction was immediate and alarming. The solutions hissed and bubbled upon contact with the iridescent smear, releasing an acrid vapor that forced me to flee the bathroom, coughing violently. When I cautiously returned 10 minutes later, wearing a bandana over my nose and mouth, I found the chemicals neutralized. The bleach had turned clear as water, the drain cleaner reduced to an inert sludge. The backpack itself appeared undamaged, but the smear had changed, contracted into a dense, pulsating mass that glowed faintly in the bathroom's dim light. As I watched, paralyzed by horrified fascination, the mass detached itself from the fabric and moved independently, flowing like mercury across the porcelain surface of the tub. It gathered itself at the drain, then seeped downward, disappearing into the plumbing of my building. I stood frozen, staring at the empty bathtub, trying to process the implications of what I'd just witnessed. The contamination hadn't been destroyed, it had simply relocated, potentially spreading through the infrastructure of the apartment complex. And I had facilitated its movement, perhaps accelerated whatever process had begun in those woods. Sleep became impossible without pharmaceutical assistance. The pills my doctor prescribed provided dreamless unconsciousness, but left me groggy and disoriented during waking hours. I returned to work after a week of absence, moving through my responsibilities like an automaton. Colleagues noticed the change in me, the weight loss, the constant fatigue, the startled reactions to sudden movements or sounds, but I deflected their concerns with vague references to a virus contracted while camping. At night, I began to hear the rumbling again, distant at first, emanating from the pipes in my walls but gradually growing louder and more distinct. Sometimes it seemed to come from outside my building, sometimes from the apartment next door, sometimes from directly beneath my feet. I couldn't determine if my neighbors heard it too. I'd become too paranoid to ask directly, fearing their answers might confirm my worst suspicions. 2 weeks after my return from the forest, I noticed the first rectangular object in my everyday environment. It appeared on my walk to work, a perfectly smooth, slightly iridescent surface embedded in a brick wall I passed every day. No larger than a playing card, it would have been easy to overlook if I hadn't been sensitized to its particular qualities. I stopped abruptly, other pedestrians flowing around me with irritated glances. The object pulsed slightly as I stared, its surface rippling like disturbed water. When I tentatively reached toward it, my fingers encountered nothing but rough brick, the rectangle visible only from certain angles, insubstantial as a projected image. But it was there, and over the following days I began to notice others. In the reflective surface of a puddle integrated into the pattern of my kitchen linoleum, hovering at the edge of my vision during my morning commute. Never solid enough to touch, never present long enough to document with my phone's camera, but undeniably real. The forest had followed me home. Or perhaps it had sent an emissary, a fragment of itself that now established a foothold in my world. Either way, I understood with growing certainty that my encounter in the woods had not ended when I fled. It had merely entered a new phase. By the 3rd week after my return, I recognized that ignoring the phenomenon would not make it disappear. Whatever had attached itself to me in that forest was not diminishing with time or distance. If anything, its manifestations were becoming more frequent and intrusive. The rectangular anomalies appeared daily now, often in locations impossible to rationalize as tricks of light or overtired imagination. The rumbling sounds had developed distinct patterns, almost like speech in a language just beyond my comprehension. Most concerning were the dreams that broke through even my medicated sleep, visions of that tear in reality widening, expanding beyond the forest to encompass urban environments. In these nightmares, I watched helplessly as the monoliths appeared in city parks, on busy streets, and the lobbies of office buildings. People walked past them, oblivious to their significance until the vibrations began and spaces between worlds thinned to transparency. I awoke from these dreams with a sense of urgent responsibility. Whatever was happening, I seemed to be the only person aware of it. Patient zero in an incursion that defied conventional understanding. If I couldn't stop it, I could at least try to understand it, to document its progression before... Before what? I couldn't articulate what endgame I feared, but the dread remained, constant and gnawing. My search for information began online, using carefully chosen keywords to avoid algorithms that might flag me for psychiatric intervention. Rectangular anomalies in forest, time distortion while hiking, iridescent markings on tent. These queries returned nothing useful, just camping equipment advertisements and articles about optical illusions in natural settings. I expanded my search, exploring forums dedicated to unexplained phenomena and paranormal experiences. Most contained the expected mixture of obvious hoaxes, delusional ramblings, and credulous acceptance of easily debunked events. But occasionally, buried within these digital repositories of the strange and marginal, I found accounts that resonated with elements of my experience. A hiker in the Carpathian Mountains described losing 7 hours while exploring a remote valley, returning to find his campsite altered in subtle ways. A forest ranger in Oregon reported rectangular windows appearing in the woods under his jurisdiction, visible only from certain angles and at specific times of day. A geology student claimed to have found a perfectly smooth stone monolith that disappeared when she returned with research equipment to document it. None of these accounts matched my experience exactly, but together they suggested I wasn't entirely alone in encountering phenomena that defied conventional explanation. I created anonymous accounts to contact these individuals, hoping to compare notes and perhaps find patterns that might illuminate what we had collectively experienced. Few responded, and those who did seemed reluctant to revisit their encounters. The forest ranger had taken early retirement shortly after his report and moved to a desert community where, he told me, the horizon stays where it's supposed to. The geology student had abandoned her studies entirely, refusing to discuss anything related to her discovery. Only the Carpathian hiker engaged substantively, exchanging detailed descriptions of his experience that paralleled mine in disturbing ways. "The forest becomes aware of you," he wrote in one message, "not like an animal or even a conscious entity, but like an immune system identifying a foreign presence. What happened to us is a response, a mechanism for examining anomalies that appear within its boundaries." His theory, developed over years of obsessive research after his encounter, suggested that certain remote locations served as thin places where conventional reality overlapped with something else. Not a parallel dimension in the science fiction sense, but a different expression of space-time with its own physics and organizing principles. These places normally existed in stable separation, but occasionally the boundary between them weakened, allowing elements from one side to bleed into the other. "The rectangles are like viewing windows," he explained. "They appear when the separation is especially thin. What lies on the other side isn't malevolent, just fundamentally incompatible with our reality. The danger comes from prolonged interaction. Each exposure makes the boundary between worlds more permeable." His words chilled me, confirming fears I'd been reluctant to articulate even to myself. The increasing frequency of anomalies in my environment suggested the boundary was indeed becoming more permeable, with my unwitting participation as the catalyst. Seeking more structured information, I expanded my research to academic sources. Most mainstream scientific publications offered nothing relevant. Conventional physics and biology had no framework for the phenomena I'd experienced. But in more speculative corners of theoretical physics and consciousness studies, I found concepts that offered at least metaphorical handles for understanding what might be happening. Quantum field theories suggesting reality emerges from interactions between fundamental fields. Philosophical discussions of panpsychism proposing that consciousness might be an intrinsic property of matter, rather than exclusive to brains. Anthropological studies of liminal spaces across cultural traditions, places considered thresholds between ordinary and extraordinary realms. None provided concrete answers, but collectively they helped me construct a tentative model for conceptualizing my experience. The forest I'd visited wasn't just a physical location, but a nexus point where the fabric of reality grew thin enough to permit interaction with something beyond conventional understanding. My presence had disturbed this delicate equilibrium, and now the disturbance was propagating outward, following me into the wider world. This theoretical framework offered no practical solutions, however. Understanding the nature of my predicament did nothing to resolve it, and the progressive intensification of anomalies suggested time was running short. The rectangular windows appeared with increasing frequency and duration. The rumbling sounds had graduated from nocturnal disturbances to near-constant background noise, audible even in crowded public spaces that should have drowned out subtle acoustic phenomena. Most alarming were the physical changes I'd begun to notice in myself. My sleep disturbances had progressed beyond insomnia and nightmares to include episodes of unconscious activity. I would awaken to find myself in different rooms from where I'd fallen asleep, sometimes standing before mirrors or windows, staring at reflective surfaces as though expecting them to show something other than my own haggard face. My skin had developed a subtle iridescence in certain lighting, similar to the sheen I'd observed on the monoliths and the contamination that had spread across my backpack. Medical tests showed no dermatological abnormalities, but I knew what I saw. A gradual transformation that suggested the boundary violation worked in both directions. Whatever lay beyond that tear in reality wasn't just entering my world. I was partially entering its mbo. By the 6th week after my forest encounter, I had compiled an extensive digital archive of research notes, witness accounts, theoretical models, and documentation of my own progressively stranger experiences. I arranged for this archive to be automatically emailed to several trusted contacts, colleagues and friends who, while they might not immediately believe its contents, would at least preserve the information should anything happen to me. Because I had reached a terrible conclusion, I needed to return to the forest, not from curiosity or scientific interest, but from desperate self-preservation and a growing sense of responsibility for whatever incursion I had inadvertently facilitated. The boundary violation had begun there, and if any possibility of sealing it existed, I would need to return to the point of origin. The decision terrified me. Every instinct screamed against deliberately walking back into the place that had infected my reality with something alien and incomprehensible. But the alternative, watching passively as the contamination spread, potentially beyond myself to the wider world, seemed even more unthinkable. I made methodical preparations, approaching the task with the detached precision of someone planning their own funeral. I arranged an extended leave of absence from work, citing medical necessity with documentation from a psychiatrist who had diagnosed me with PTSD from an unspecified traumatic event. I paid bills in advance, set up automatic payments for recurring expenses, and drafted letters to family members to be delivered in the event of my disappearance. Most importantly, I researched protective measures, not from conventional dangers like wildlife or exposure, but from the specific phenomena I had encountered. Folklore and esoteric traditions offered suggestions: iron and salt as barriers against supernatural entities, mirrors to reflect harmful energies, symbolic patterns that allegedly reinforced reality against intrusion from other planes of existence. I had no idea if any of these would prove effective against what awaited me in the forest, but their psychological value alone justified their inclusion in my preparations. Having some form of perceived protection, however dubious, might prevent the kind of paralyzing terror that had overcome me during my first encounter. With preparations complete, I set a date for my return, exactly 7 weeks after my original flight from the forest. The symmetry felt appropriate, though I couldn't have articulated why. Perhaps some part of me recognized patterns in these events that my conscious mind couldn't yet perceive. Cycles and correspondences operating according to principles outside conventional understanding. The night before my departure, I stood before the bathroom mirror, examining the changes in my appearance. The iridescence had spread, now visible across my chest and shoulders regardless of lighting conditions. My eyes had developed a strange quality, not a change in color but in depth, as though one could look into them and keep looking beyond what human eyes should contain. "I'm going back," I told my reflection, half expecting it to respond independently. "I'm going to find those monoliths again and what?" I had no concrete plan beyond returning to the site of the original boundary violation. No certain method for sealing the tear between worlds. No guarantee that my presence would do anything but accelerate the very process I hoped to halt. But I had to try. Whatever awaited me in that forest, resolution or dissolution, salvation or transformation, it represented my only hope of understanding what I had become and what I might yet prevent. As I turned away from the mirror, I caught a glimpse of movement from the corner of my eye, my reflection remaining in place for a fraction of a second after I had already begun to move, its expression not quite matching my own. By the time I looked back directly, everything appeared normal again. But I knew what I had seen. The boundary was thinning, not just in the forest or in the world around me, but within me. I was becoming a walking threshold between realities, a human monolith. Tomorrow I would return to where it all began, carrying this terrible liminality back to its source. What would happen then I could not predict. But as I prepared for sleep that would surely not come, I found myself oddly calm, resigned to whatever awaited me among those ancient trees and the spaces between them. The drive back to the forest trailhead felt surreal, as though I were moving through a dream landscape rather than the familiar countryside. Colors seemed too vibrant, sounds too crisp, every sensory input amplified to near hallucinatory intensity. Whether this represented an actual change in my perception or merely the heightened awareness of someone approaching a pivotal moment, I couldn't determine. I had chosen to arrive near sunset, timing my entry into the forest to coincide with dusk. That liminal period when day transitions to night, when boundaries of all kinds grow naturally thinner. The parking area was empty when I arrived. No other vehicles present, no signs of human activity. It looked exactly as it had 7 weeks earlier, untouched by the profound strangeness that had transpired within the woods it served. As I gathered my equipment from the trunk, I noticed the first anomaly, a rectangular distortion in the air about 20 feet away, hovering at chest height with no visible means of support. Unlike previous manifestations, which had appeared fleetingly and required specific viewing angles, this one remained stable and apparent regardless of my position. Its surface rippled with iridescent patterns identical to those that now marked my skin. "I see you," I said aloud, surprising myself with the steadiness of my voice. "I'm coming to find the rest of you." The rectangle pulsed once, its colors intensifying momentarily, then vanished with a subtle popping sound that seemed to compress the air around it. Message delivered, acknowledgement received, though I couldn't have explained how I knew this represented communication rather than random phenomena. With my pack secured, I approached the trail that led into the forest. The path appeared clearer than I remembered, almost artificially defined against the surrounding vegetation. No branches obstructed the way, no undergrowth encroached upon the dirt track. It was as though the forest had deliberately cleared a route for my return, removing obstacles that might delay my arrival. This obvious manipulation should have terrified me. Instead, I felt a peculiar calm descend as I took my first steps into the trees. Whatever awaited me deeper in the woods, it wanted me to reach it without impediment. That suggested purpose rather than malevolence. An entity or force with specific intentions rather than mindless hunger or destructive impulse. The quality of light changed as I moved deeper along the trail, transitioning from the golden hues of sunset to something greener and more diffuse, filtering through the canopy with an almost underwater quality. Sounds became muffled yet simultaneously clearer, each rustle and snap distinct but somehow contained, as though I were hearing them through a medium more substantial than air. Time behaved strangely again, compressing and expanding unpredictably. My watch showed barely 15 minutes had passed when I reached the first significant landmark, a fallen log across the path that I distinctly remembered encountering an hour into my original hike. Yet the journey felt appropriately lengthy, my muscles recording the effort of sustained walking despite the chronological compression. As darkness settled fully among the trees, I activated the headlamp I'd brought, its beam cutting through the gloom with surprising effectiveness. The forest ahead revealed itself in slices of illuminated underbrush and tree trunks, appearing perfectly ordinary within the circumscribed circle of light. But in my peripheral vision, shapes moved that had no place in any natural woodland. Angular geometries that defied perspective, flickering presences that registered as absence rather than substance. I continued forward, neither hurrying nor delaying my progress. The sense of being observed intensified with each step, but unlike my previous visit, it no longer triggered fight-or-flight responses. Instead, I felt a growing certainty that I was approaching something that had been waiting for my return, something ancient and patient and utterly alien to human understanding, yet not inherently hostile. The trail ended abruptly at the edge of a clearing I recognized immediately, the same space where I had camped 7 weeks ago. It appeared unchanged at first glance, the fire ring still visible in the center, the ground still covered in a carpet of fallen leaves. But as I played my light across the area, differences emerged from the familiar tableau. The stones of the fire ring had rearranged themselves into a perfect circle, each one equidistant from its neighbors with mathematical precision. The fallen leaves no longer lay in random patterns but had settled into intricate mandalas that spiraled outward from the circle's center. Most strikingly, the trees surrounding the clearing had shifted position slightly, their trunks now forming a symmetrical arrangement that could not have occurred through natural growth. The forest had reconfigured itself in my absence, imposing order upon chaos, geometry upon organic randomness. And at the center of this transformed space stood what I had come to find, not one rectangular monolith, but 7, arranged in a circle around the fire ring, their surfaces gleaming in the beam of my headlamp. I approached cautiously, sweeping my light across each monolith in turn. They appeared identical at first, but closer inspection revealed subtle differences in the iridescent patterns flowing across their surfaces. These patterns moved with purpose, not random shifting of colors, but deliberate progressions that suggested language or code. As I reached the edge of the fire ring, a vibration began, not emanating from any single monolith but from the space they collectively enclosed. It resonated at a frequency that made my teeth ache and vision blur, intensifying gradually until it seemed to penetrate my body at a cellular level. The rumbling sound I had come to dread followed, rising from somewhere beneath the earth, filling the clearing with its rhythmic pulsations. I should have fled then, should have abandoned this insane quest and returned to the relative safety of the world I knew. Instead, I removed my pack and set it aside, then stepped into the circle of monoliths, placing my feet deliberately within the stone ring where I had once built a fire. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. The vibration synchronized with my heartbeat. The rumbling sound resolved into something almost comprehensible, and the air within the circle took on a visible texture, like heat waves intensified 1,000-fold. The monoliths began to glow from within, their light pulsing in unison, illuminating the clearing far more effectively than my headlamp. I switched off the artificial light, letting the monolith's radiance wash over me. The iridescent patterns on my skin responded, glowing in sympathetic resonance, creating a visual connection between my body and the alien objects surrounding me. I felt myself becoming part of whatever circuit they had established. Not a prisoner or victim, but a component, a necessary element in a system whose purpose remained beyond my comprehension. Then the tear appeared, not between the monoliths as I had expected, but directly above the fire ring, opening an empty air like a vertical incision in the fabric of reality. It widened slowly, edges peeling back to reveal the space beyond, the impossible geometries and colors I had glimpsed during my flight through the forest weeks before. But now, standing within the circle of monoliths, my perception had somehow expanded to accommodate what lay beyond the tear. I could see it not as chaotic nightmare, but as complex order. A reality operating according to principles that simply differed from those governing my familiar world. The entities moving within that space were not monsters but inhabitants, as natural to their environment as humans to Earth. Their forms dictated by the physical laws of their domain. Understanding flooded through me, carried on the vibrations that now penetrated to my core. Not complete comprehension. Human consciousness simply wasn't structured to fully grasp the totality of what I witnessed, but enough to recognize the nature of what had occurred during my first visit to this clearing. The forest had always been a threshold, one of many places around the world where the boundary between realities grew naturally thin. For millennia, these thresholds had remained stable, allowing minimal transfer of energy and information between domains, maintaining separation that preserved the integrity of both spaces. But something had changed recently. Human activity, perhaps, or shifts in the fundamental forces that maintained cosmic architecture. The thresholds were failing, the boundaries eroding. What had happened to me was not an isolated incident, but an early manifestation of a process occurring across the globe. The entities on the other side were aware of this degradation and had been attempting to address it. To repair the damage before complete boundary failure resulted in catastrophic merging of incompatible realities. My initial intrusion into this clearing had coincided with one of their repair attempts, placing me at the center of a process I couldn't understand. The rectangular monoliths were tools or instruments deployed to reinforce weakened points in the boundary. My encounter with them had marked me as an anomaly, a human who had experienced direct contact with their technology and survived with consciousness intact. The contamination that had followed me from the forest wasn't an infection or attack, it was an established connection, a link that allowed them to study human physiology and psychology through me to determine whether cooperation might be possible in their boundary maintenance efforts. The progressive changes in my perception, the increasing frequency of anomalies in my environment, all represented their attempts to modify my consciousness gradually, to build a bridge between fundamentally different modes of existence. And now they had succeeded. Standing within the circle of monoliths, I functioned as interpreter and conduit. Human consciousness temporarily expanded to comprehend aspects of their reality, while remaining grounded in my own. Through me, they communicated their purpose and predicament. The boundary was failing faster than they could repair it. Their efforts to establish contact with humans, beings who occupied the reality leaking into theirs, had largely failed, with most subjects unable to survive the cognitive adjustments necessary for meaningful communication. I represented a rare success, a human capable of serving as interface between worlds. They needed my help. Not just mine individually, but human assistance more broadly. The work of boundary maintenance required coordination from both sides, simultaneous reinforcement of the threshold from their reality and mine. Without such cooperation, the degradation would continue accelerating until catastrophic failure occurred. Not apocalypse in the conventional sense, but something more profound and irreversible, the collapse of coherent reality itself. The choice they offered wasn't really a choice at all. Help them preserve the boundary, or watch both our worlds dissolve into chaos as incompatible physical laws attempted to reconcile in spaces never designed for such integration. But how could I, a single human with no authority or resources, possibly facilitate the kind of large-scale cooperation they required? The answer emerged from the vibrations themselves, conveyed not in words but in concepts that unfolded within my expanded consciousness. I would serve as prototype and proof, the first successfully modified human capable of perceiving both realities simultaneously, without losing sanity or selfhood. Through me, they would refine the process, making it safer and more reliable for others. I would become recruiter and instructor, identifying suitable candidates and guiding them through the transition I had undergone accidentally. A global network of human assistants, working in conjunction with their counterparts beyond the threshold, could stabilize the boundaries long enough for more permanent solutions to be developed. The alternative was continued degradation, accelerating anomalies appearing worldwide, and eventual dissolution of the ordered realities we respectively inhabited. As this understanding crystallized within me, the tier above the fire ring began to contract, edges drawing together until only a narrow seam remained visible. The vibration changed frequency, becoming almost soothing rather than disruptive. The monoliths dimmed slightly, their glow settling into a steady radiance rather than pulsing intensity. They were waiting for my response, though I sensed they already knew what it would be. The modifications to my perception had progressed too far for reversal. I could not return to normal human existence even if I chose to reject their proposal. And beyond self-interest lay the irrefutable logic of necessity. Someone had to begin this work, to serve as conduit between worlds that had never been meant to interact yet now required careful integration to prevent mutual destruction. I understand, I said aloud, my voice sounding strange in the vibration-filled air. I'll help you. The seam vanished completely, the tear sealed for now but capable of reopening when needed. The monoliths brightened momentarily in what I somehow recognized as acknowledgement, then dimmed to barely perceptible luminescence. The vibration receded gradually, returning to levels that human senses could tolerate comfortably. I stood alone in the clearing, surrounded by 7 rectangular objects that now appeared as ordinary stone markers to conventional perception, but I could still see their true nature, the complex technology disguised as simple monoliths, the patterns flowing across surfaces that ordinary vision would register as merely reflective. My transformation was complete. I remained human in body and largely in mind, but my perception had been permanently altered, expanded to encompass aspects of reality most people would never experience. I could see the boundary between worlds now, could recognize where it grew thin and vulnerable, could identify potential points of failure requiring attention. More importantly, I could recognize others with the potential for similar adaptation, humans whose neurological structure and psychological flexibility might allow them to undergo the transition successfully. They would be rare, perhaps 1 in thousands, but they existed. My task was to find them, to explain what was happening to our world, to guide them through the process I had experienced. Together, we would form the human contingent of a trans-reality maintenance crew, preserving the structural integrity of existence itself until more permanent solutions could be implemented. It was a mandate both absurd and profound, a responsibility I had never sought yet could not ethically reject. As I gathered my pack and prepared to leave the clearing, I noticed the final transformation. The forest around me now visible in its true nature, not just trees and earth but a complex tapestry of energies and information flows. A living system that functioned as interface between incompatible realities. What had seemed hostile during my first visit now revealed itself as simply alien, operating according to principles I was only beginning to comprehend. I would return to human civilization carrying this expanded perception, this terrible knowledge of cosmic architecture under threat. The work ahead would be difficult, perhaps impossible, identifying suitable candidates, convincing them of truths that defied conventional understanding, guiding them through transformations that would irrevocably alter their relationship to reality. But the alternative was unthinkable. As I made my way back along the trail toward my waiting vehicle, I began mentally composing the narratives I would use, the explanations and demonstrations that might convince at least a few others to join this strangest of endeavors. The boundary needed maintenance from both sides, and I had become its first human engineer. The forest around me seemed to approve, adjusting its patterns to facilitate my passage, guiding me back to the world I would now perceive differently forever. Not with fear or hostility, but with the clear sight of someone who had glimpsed the machinery beneath apparent reality and accepted responsibility for its continued function. 3 months have passed since my return from the forest. Winter has settled over the city, covering familiar landscapes with snow that appears ordinary to most observers, but reveals complex energy patterns to my altered perception. The transformation that began with a chance encounter in a remote clearing continues to develop, my understanding expanding as the entities beyond the threshold communicate through the connection we've established. I've learned to navigate 2 simultaneous realities, the conventional world of human society and the underlying framework of boundaries and thresholds that separates our domain from others. This dual awareness no longer overwhelms me as it did initially. I've developed techniques for filtering my perception, focusing on ordinary reality when necessary, while maintaining peripheral awareness of the boundary conditions surrounding me. The physical manifestations of my connection have stabilized. The iridescence remains visible on my skin but has stopped spreading, now covering approximately 30% of my body in patterns that shift subtly in response to boundary fluctuations in my vicinity. I've adapted my wardrobe to conceal these markings when among ordinary people, though occasionally someone with particularly acute perception notices something unusual about my appearance. I've begun the work assigned to me, identifying potential candidates for recruitment into what I've come to think of as the Boundary Maintenance Network. The entities provide guidance, highlighting individuals whose neurological structure suggests compatibility with the modifications required for trans-reality perception. I approach these people carefully, assessing their psychological resilience before revealing even hints of what I've experienced. Most respond with predictable skepticism or concern for my mental health. A few recognize something genuine in my account, perhaps because they've experienced minor boundary anomalies themselves, inexplicable time slips, glimpses of geometries that shouldn't exist, encounters with places that feel wrong in ways they can't articulate. These individuals become my focus, potential allies in the work of stabilizing reality itself. The process of bringing others into awareness requires delicacy and patience. Unlike my accidental and traumatic initiation, I can offer guided exposure to boundary phenomena, controlled introductions to the vibrations and resonances that facilitate perception across domains. Of the 17 candidates I've approached so far, 3 have begun the transition successfully, their consciousness expanding gradually to encompass aspects of the reality beyond the threshold. Jordan was first, a quantum physics graduate student whose research had already led her to question conventional models of spacetime. Her adaptation progressed smoothly, her scientific background providing conceptual frameworks that accommodated the seemingly impossible phenomena she encountered. Within weeks, she could perceive the rectangular anomalies without assistance, could feel the vibrations that signaled boundary thinning in urban environments. Kai followed, an artist whose abstract sculptures had unconsciously replicated patterns from beyond the threshold, suggesting innate sensitivity to trans-reality information. His transition was more difficult, accompanied by perceptual distortions that initially manifested as apparent psychosis. But with careful guidance and support from both myself and the entities, he stabilized into functional awareness. His artistic work now deliberately incorporating elements that strengthen boundary integrity, through means I still don't fully understand. Elena came third, a retired anthropologist whose lifetime studying liminal cultural practices had prepared her consciousness for expansion beyond conventional parameters. Her adaptation continues, slower than the others, but potentially more complete, her decades of disciplined observation allowing her to integrate new perceptual information without becoming overwhelmed. Together, we constitute the beginning of a human response team to boundary degradation. Each brings different skills and perspectives. Jordan's theoretical understanding of quantum fields, Kai's intuitive grasp of reinforcing patterns, Elena's contextual knowledge of how human cultures have historically interacted with threshold phenomena. I serve as coordinator and primary liaison with the entities. My longer experience with trans-reality perception, providing a template for their developing awareness. Our work focuses on identifying and reinforcing vulnerable points in the boundary, places where the threshold between realities has grown dangerously thin. These locations occur more frequently than I initially realized. Abandoned industrial sites where chemical processes have somehow weakened spatial integrity. Ancient ceremonial grounds where millennia of ritualized attention have worn pathways between domains. Deep subterranean spaces where the physical architecture of Earth itself creates natural resonance chambers. At each site, we perform interventions designed by the entities and translated through my expanded perception. Sometimes these involve physical modifications to the environment, arrangements of specific materials in geometric patterns that dampen harmful vibrations. Sometimes our presence alone suffices, human consciousness properly attuned serving as a stabilizing influence on fluctuating boundary conditions. Occasionally, we must facilitate controlled interactions between domains, carefully managed exchanges of energy that relieve pressure building along stress points in the threshold. The work is exhausting and often dangerous. Boundary reinforcement requires sustained attention at frequencies human neurophysiology wasn't designed to maintain. Each intervention leaves us drained, our perception temporarily dulled, our connection to ordinary reality strained by prolonged focus on what lies beyond it. Recovery periods become necessary, days or sometimes weeks when we retreat from active threshold management and re-immerse ourselves in conventional human experience. During these recovery phases, I continue searching for additional candidates, expanding our network to address the accelerating degradation of boundary integrity worldwide. The entities provide coordinates for priority regions, geographic locations experiencing unusually rapid threshold thinning, places requiring immediate intervention to prevent localized boundary failures that could propagate into larger systemic collapse. Our most recent operation targeted an abandoned research facility in northern Finland, where experiments in particle physics conducted decades ago had created a persistent weakness in local reality. The boundary there had deteriorated to critical levels, vibrations spilling into conventional space with sufficient intensity to affect ordinary humans in the vicinity. Local reports described bizarre acoustic phenomena, unexplained equipment malfunctions, and psychological disturbances among residents of nearby communities. Jordan, Kai and I traveled to the site while Elena coordinated remotely, her physical condition preventing field operations in such an extreme environment. The facility itself stood in a clearing surrounded by dense pine forest, its concrete structures partially reclaimed by vegetation, but still recognizable as a scientific installation. To conventional perception, it appeared merely derelict, abandoned buildings slowly succumbing to weather and time. Through our altered senses, however, it revealed itself as a wound in reality, a place where the boundary had worn so thin that direct visual perception of the domain beyond was possible without technological assistance. Rectangular tiers hovered in open air throughout the complex, some large enough to admit human passage, others microscopic but numerous, like a sieve allowing constant transfer of energy between incompatible realities. The entities had prepared us with intervention protocols, specific movements, sounds, and mental states that would help stabilize the deteriorating threshold. For 3 days, we worked in shifts, maintaining constant attention on the boundary fluctuations, applying techniques that felt part physics, part ritual, part direct manipulation of fundamental forces through consciousness itself. Gradually, the tiers began to close, the largest first, then progressively smaller ruptures, until only microscopic perforations remained. These would heal naturally over time, the entities assured us now that the major breaches had been sealed. As we concluded our operation and prepared to depart, the facility appeared different through both conventional and expanded perception, still abandoned, still decaying, but no longer leaking reality from its seams. This pattern of identification, intervention, and recovery has become our existence. Jordan maintaining her academic position as cover for research that directly supports our boundary work, Kai incorporating maintenance symbols into installations commissioned for public spaces, Elena developing historical context for threshold phenomena that helps predict future degradation patterns, and myself continuing to recruit to coordinate, to serve as primary translator between human understanding and the entity's incomprehensible perspective. We are too few, our efforts too limited to address the global scale of boundary deterioration. The entities confirm what I've suspected since beginning this work. The threshold weakening is accelerating despite our interventions, driven by factors both natural and anthropogenic. Cosmic background radiation, shifting magnetic fields, technological developments that inadvertently generate resonance, patterns damaging to trans-reality architecture, all contribute to a progressive thinning that our small network can temporarily mitigate but not reverse. More concerning are indications that other entities, different from those I initially encountered, have become aware of the weakening boundary and see opportunity, rather than catastrophe in its potential collapse. These opposing forces, the entities term them dissolutionists in concepts that translate poorly to human language, actively work to accelerate degradation, seeking integration of realities that would destroy the coherence of both domains but potentially allow new forms of existence to emerge from the chaos we've encountered. Evidence of their influence, boundary sites deliberately damaged rather than naturally degraded, human proxies performing rituals designed to weaken threshold integrity, technology deployed specifically to generate harmful resonance patterns. These discoveries have transformed our understanding of the situation from maintenance project to active conflict, with reality itself as contested territory. The entities have responded by accelerating our recruitment efforts, identifying clusters of potential candidates in regions experiencing heightened boundary stress. My role has expanded accordingly. No longer just recruiter and coordinator, but trainer of trainers, developing protocols that allow successful initiates to guide others through the transition to expanded awareness. Our network now includes 27 active members across 4 continents, with another 42 in various stages of perceptual transition. Each new recruit strengthens our capacity for intervention, but the rate of boundary degradation continues to outpace our growth. The entities estimate critical threshold failure within 5 years without more comprehensive measures, a timeline that lends desperate urgency to our efforts. I've begun documenting everything: the process of perceptual expansion, the techniques for boundary reinforcement, the signs of deliberate sabotage by dissolutionist forces. This record serves multiple purposes: training material for new recruits, evidence for convincing potential allies, and contingency information should our current approach fail. I maintain copies in multiple locations and formats, including one set sealed in a time capsule buried at coordinates known only to the core network members. The personal cost of this work increases as my perception continues to evolve beyond conventional human parameters. I experience episodes of dissociation when boundary activity intensifies, periods when my consciousness seems to exist partly in this reality and partly beyond the threshold. These episodes last longer each time, returning me to ordinary awareness with decreasing completeness. The entities assure me this represents adaptation rather than degradation, my consciousness developing capacity for simultaneous existence in multiple domains, becoming more effective as interface between realities. But I recognize the trajectory leads towards something less than fully human, or perhaps more than human depending on perspective. Either way, I am becoming something different from what I was before entering that forest clearing. I accept this transformation as necessary cost for the work we undertake. The boundary must be maintained, the threshold between realities preserved long enough for permanent solutions to be implemented. If personal identity becomes casualty of this effort, so be it, a small sacrifice compared to the alternative of complete reality dissolution. Tonight, I sit in my apartment reviewing data from monitoring stations our network has established at key boundary sites worldwide. The patterns confirm what I've sensed directly: a surge in degradation events across all regions, with particular intensity in areas of high population density and technological concentration. Urban centers have become hotspots of boundary thinning, human activity somehow catalyzing the very weakening we work to prevent. Tomorrow we deploy to a new priority location, a metropolitan area experiencing sudden acceleration of threshold deterioration coupled with unusual dissolutionist activity. Jordan has developed detection equipment that functions in conventional reality, allowing identification of boundary stress without expanded perception. Kai has created installation art incorporating reinforcement patterns for public spaces throughout the target zone. Elena has compiled historical records suggesting the area has served as threshold point for centuries, with local folklore describing phenomena consistent with boundary permeability. I will coordinate on site, directly engaging with local manifestations of trans-reality entities while guiding our human team through precisely calculated interventions. The operation carries significant risk, the highest concentration of boundary anomalies we've yet encountered in an urban environment, combined with confirmed dissolutionist presence working actively against our efforts. But risk has become constant companion in this strange existence I now inhabit. Since that September day when I drove to a forest seeking solitude and found instead a tear in reality, nothing has remained certain except the necessity of the work itself. The boundary must be maintained, the threshold preserved, reality kept coherent enough for life to continue its complex dance of existence. As I prepare for tomorrow's operation, checking equipment and reviewing protocols, I find myself reflecting on the person I was before entering that clearing, an ordinary human with ordinary concerns, unaware of the cosmic architecture supporting everyday existence. That person is gone, transformed by encounter with something beyond conventional understanding into something neither fully human nor fully other. What remains is purpose, clarity regarding the work that must be done. The boundary calls for maintenance. The threshold requires reinforcement. Reality itself needs defenders conscious of its fragility. Whatever I am becoming serves that necessity, and in that service I find meaning transcending individual identity or conventional existence. The forest changed me, initiating a transformation that continues with each threshold encountered, each boundary reinforced, each new recruit brought into awareness of trans-reality conditions. I am becoming interface and instrument. Human consciousness expanded to perceive and interact with forces beyond ordinary comprehension. Tomorrow brings another opportunity to fulfill that purpose, another boundary site requiring intervention, Another threshold to reinforce against forces of dissolution. I will meet it with the strange calm that has replaced fear in my expanded awareness, the certainty that comes from glimpsing the machinery beneath apparent reality and accepting responsibility for its continued function. The boundary must be maintained. The work continues, and I with it, changed but resolute, transformed but determined, no longer the person who entered that forest clearing, but something necessary for the preservation of reality itself. I've driven this route through Tennessee more times than I can count, but somehow everything about it felt hostile that evening. My husband was dozing in the passenger seat, and that left me alone with the darkness outside, the rhythmic slap of wiper blades, and the never-ending twists in the road. Rain misted the windshield, and the fog gathered in dense patches that forced me to lean forward, straining my eyes to penetrate the murk ahead. The trip had started normally enough. We'd left our home in North Carolina around noon on Friday, April 17, 2024, planning to visit my family in Kentucky for the weekend. At 42, I was no stranger to long drives, especially this familiar route that connected our lives. The weather forecast had mentioned possible storms, but nothing severe enough to postpone our journey. By early evening, however, the conditions had deteriorated far beyond what meteorologists had predicted. Something about the night made my nerves feel raw and exposed. It wasn't just the weather, though. That was challenging enough with winding lanes and slick pavement. It was a kind of heavy, oppressive quiet in the air. No other cars seemed willing to brave that stretch of road. Every time I glanced at the rearview mirror, I was half hoping to spot headlights, just so I'd know we weren't the only ones out there. But it was all emptiness behind me. Every few miles, the fog would momentarily thin, and the headlights would reveal a glimpse of towering trees leaning in on either side, forming a tunnel of branches and dripping leaves. The occasional sign, wet and reflective, reminded me we were still on a state highway. Otherwise, I could have sworn we'd drifted off into some deserted back road with no clear end. The rhythmic static on the radio did little to settle my nerves. Each pop or hiss felt like a whisper suggesting something was lurking just beyond my field of vision. I tried not to wake my husband. He'd been exhausted from a week of overnight shifts at the hospital, and there was no sense in both of us suffering through that drive. Still, part of me wanted to give him a gentle nudge, say, "Hey, something about this place feels wrong," just so I wouldn't feel so alone with my growing unease. But I kept quiet. Instead, I stayed glued to the road, breathing in shallow bursts every time I rounded another tight curve. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my fingers began to ache. The car's digital clock read 8:47 p.m., but the darkness outside suggested a much later hour. Normally, this section of highway would take roughly 40 minutes to traverse. Tonight, it felt eternal. Each mile marker appeared at glacial intervals, as if the distance between them had stretched impossibly. I focused on my breathing, trying to calm the inexplicable anxiety that had been building since sunset. The radio finally gave up its battle with the mountains, dissolving into pure static. I switched it off, leaving only the sound of rain and the steady thrum of tires on wet asphalt. The silence felt oddly heavy, as if the atmosphere itself had thickened around us. I rolled my shoulders, trying to release the tension that had accumulated there. "Just an hour more," I whispered to myself, though I knew that estimate was optimistic given the weather conditions. "Just get through this stretch and things will improve." Around one particularly narrow bend, the trees were almost uncomfortably close to the road. My headlights only illuminated a few feet ahead, leaving everything else swallowed by impenetrable gloom. I slowed the car to a crawl, unwilling to risk a collision with wildlife or a fallen branch. Then, off to the left, I saw movement in my peripheral vision, maybe 20 feet away. Something massive peeled away from the tree line. At first, my brain refused to register what I was seeing. It was as if an entire trunk had stepped free from the rest of the forest. A jolt of unease shot through me, and I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles whitened. My mind scrambled for a logical explanation. Maybe the fog was playing tricks with shadows. Maybe a snagged branch moved in the wind. But whatever it was appeared huge, taller than any living thing has a right to be, and it seemed to vanish back into the darkness in one smooth motion. One moment, there was this towering shape. The next, nothing. I wanted to slam on the brakes and get a better look, but I was afraid the car might skid on the wet asphalt. Besides, I couldn't risk stopping in such an isolated spot, with no shoulder to pull onto and no visibility behind me. For a few seconds, I seriously questioned my own eyes. A detached part of me was yelling, it was just the fog, while another part insisted I'd just witnessed something that didn't belong in any nature guide. My breath came quicker as I pressed the accelerator, motivated by a primal instinct that shouted, "Get away!" Each second dragged until the next clearing appeared, where I spotted a lonely, flickering motel sign in the distance. It seemed like a tiny beacon of safety, a reminder that civilization still existed. I exhaled shakily, thinking maybe I'd just let my imagination wander. The gloom could have twisted a perfectly ordinary tree trunk into something monstrous, right? Then the pang of doubt came roaring back. I'd seen it move. It didn't sway like branches in the wind. It slinked back the way a tall person might step behind a wall, only this was the height of a 3-story building, maybe taller. No way was that normal. I thought about stopping at that motel, but it looked deserted. Just a handful of rooms with the lights off. It didn't feel any safer than the open road, so I kept going. My husband stirred in his seat, mumbled something about the rain, and drifted back to half sleep. I envied him for a second. I'd give anything not to be so keyed up right now. We pressed on, the road curving again under a canopy of dripping leaves. My eyes kept darting to the side, expecting another glimpse of that shape. Each time the wind rustled the branches, my pulse picked up. But the trees refused to reveal any more secrets. I was tempted to rifle through the radio channels again, just for some human voices, but I realized my hands were shaking too much and I didn't want to lose focus on the wheel. The digital clock on the dashboard moved with excruciating slowness. 9:15 p.m., then 9:22. The minutes crawled by as if time itself had grown viscous in the dense fog. My eyes burned from the strain of staring into the murk, searching for dangers that might materialize at any moment. Eventually, we came upon a slightly wider stretch, and there was a rundown diner with all its lights off. It was just as desolate as the motel, but the parking lot offered a place to pull over. I did briefly to calm my nerves. My husband blinked awake, asked if everything was all right. "Just needed a moment," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "The visibility is terrible." He nodded groggily, rubbing his eyes. "Want me to drive for a bit?" I wanted to tell him everything, about the strange, towering figure I'd glimpsed, about the irrational fear that had lodged itself in my chest, but the words refused to come. How could I explain what I'd seen when I barely understood it myself? I just stared at the dripping overhang above the diner's door, half expecting that giant figure to emerge from behind the building. "No, I'm fine," I finally answered. "Just needed to rest my eyes for a minute." We didn't stay long. Soon I was back on the road, forcing myself to concentrate on the dark pavement ahead. I glanced at the clock and realized how little distance we'd covered in what felt like an eternity. Every minute felt stretched and distorted, as if time was slowed down by the anxiety gnawing at me. As the highway wound deeper into darkness, I kept looking into the mirror, certain I'd catch a glimpse of that towering shape following us, only to see fog and empty road. In the passenger seat, my husband stirred again, concerned by my quiet tension, but I just told him I was fine. No point in scaring him until I had my own mind sorted out. The rain intensified, falling in heavy sheets that reduced visibility to mere feet. I could barely make out the white line at the edge of the road. The windshield wipers struggled to keep up, sweeping frantically across the glass, only to have their work immediately undone by the deluge. "Maybe we should find somewhere to stop until this passes," my husband suggested, now fully awake and witnessing the severity of the conditions. I shook my head. "There's nowhere to stop out here." The truth was, I couldn't bear the thought of being stationary in these woods, not after what I'd seen. Movement, even slow and treacherous movement, felt safer than sitting still. The road narrowed again, hemmed in by steep embankments on both sides. Towering pines loomed overhead, their needles forming a canopy that seemed to trap us in a tunnel of darkness. I felt increasingly claustrophobic, as if the forest itself was closing in around us. A flash of lightning illuminated the scene for a split second, revealing the full extent of our isolation. In that brief moment, I saw nothing but wilderness stretching in all directions. No houses, no other vehicles, just an endless sea of trees swaying in the wind. The subsequent thunder shook the car, reverberating through my already frayed nerves. I tried to focus on practical matters, maintaining a safe speed, keeping the car centered in the lane, watching for fallen branches or flooding. But my mind kept circling back to that impossible silhouette I'd glimpsed earlier. What if it wasn't? A trick of light and shadow? What if something truly abnormal was out there in the woods? The rational part of my brain rejected this immediately. There are no monsters, no giants hiding in American forests. Yet the image remained stubbornly fixed in my memory. Too tall, too deliberate in its movement to be easily dismissed. Another lightning flash. Another glimpse of the surrounding forest. This time I thought I saw something in the tree line to our right. A disturbance in the natural pattern. A vertical shape where horizontal branches should be. But the darkness returned too quickly for me to be certain. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice tight. My husband peered into the blackness. "See what?" "I don't know. Something. By those trees." He squinted, trying to follow my gaze, but the darkness had swallowed whatever I thought I'd seen. "Probably just a tree trunk," he said reassuringly. "The lightning makes everything look strange." I nodded, not wanting to alarm him further, but I knew what I'd seen hadn't been just another tree. It had moved, or at least it seemed to have moved in that fractional second of illumination. Soon enough, the road straightened somewhat and the forest retreated into the background. The uneasy weight on my chest eased slightly, though it never vanished completely. I spent the remaining miles mentally replaying what I'd seen back there, my thoughts racing. Had I really seen something move? Was it just a trick of shadows? But each time I recalled how it had vanished, I shuddered. The memory refused to feel like a simple illusion. We finally passed a sign announcing we were close to the state line. I breathed a cautious sigh of relief. Maybe once we made it into Kentucky, the night would lose its menace and I could chalk the whole thing up to a creepy, roadside hallucination. But something in my gut insisted the memory would linger long after the fog lifted. And as we drove on, I stole one last glance behind us, half convinced that Shape was still out there, concealed in the dark, watching me leave. I pulled into the truck stop around midnight, drawn to its flickering neon sign like a castaway spotting land. Fat droplets of rain tapped against the roof as I parked beneath a weak street lamp. Even in that dim light, the place looked worn down. Faded paint, old vending machines humming in the corner, and a few greasy puddles on the asphalt reflected the harsh fluorescent lighting. I sat in the driver's seat for a moment, just letting the engine idle. My husband, now fully awake, looked over at me with worry, no doubt sensing the tension radiating off me. I still hadn't told him about what I witnessed earlier, and part of me didn't know how. It sounded insane, even in my own head. "We should stretch our legs," he said finally, breaking the silence. "And maybe grab some coffee. We've still got a couple hours to go." Despite my reluctance to leave the relative safety of the car, we climbed out. We needed a break from that winding road. The air smelled like diesel and damp concrete. The light above the pumps flickered and buzzed every few seconds, making shadows shrink and grow across the parking lot. That steady pulse kept me on edge. I couldn't stop imagining that giant shape from earlier lurking just beyond the glow. Inside the cramped convenience store, I grabbed a coffee while my husband wandered off to stretch his legs. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a harsh glow that made everyone look sickly and worn. A lone cashier stood behind the counter, staring blankly at a small television playing an old sitcom rerun. Two truck drivers sat at a small table in the corner, speaking in hushed tones over styrofoam cups of coffee. I opened a search on my phone, half embarrassed to type keywords like massive tree creature, Tennessee cryptid, anything that might explain what I'd seen. Nothing relevant popped up, just a scattering of myths and rumors about odd shapes in the woods, local ghost stories or sightings that never went anywhere. The lack of answers made me feel more alone than ever. I approached the cashier, a weathered woman in her 60s with dark circles under her eyes. "Nasty night out there," I ventured. She nodded without enthusiasm. "Been like this for 3 days now." We just came through the mountain pass, I said, trying to sound casual. Barely saw another soul on the road. Not surprised. Locals know better than to drive that stretch in weather like this. Something about her tone made me pause. What do you mean by that? She shrugged, eyes darting briefly to the window before returning to me. Just not safe with the visibility so poor. Those curves can be treacherous. There was something she wasn't saying, I was certain of it. I leaned in slightly. I thought I saw something strange back there. In the woods. Her expression didn't change, but I noticed her fingers tighten around the pen she was holding. Lots of wildlife in those parts, she said dismissively. This wasn't wildlife, I insisted. It was tall, really tall. Like I said, she cut me off. Bad weather plays tricks on the eyes. You want anything else with that coffee? We stepped back out into the damp night and my husband started filling the tank. The single attendant on duty, an older man, approached with a polite nod. When I blurted something about the road being eerily empty, he just shrugged. His eyes flicked toward the dark highway like he knew more than he was letting on. We get travelers coming through, he muttered. Some swear they see things this time of year. Then he clammed up, almost like he regretted saying anything at all. I wanted to press him for details, but I couldn't shake the sense that he'd just shut down. My husband looked at me with concern, probably wondering why I was so rattled. I offered a tight smile, hoping he'd chalk it up to exhaustion. Truth was, my mind was spinning with thoughts of that impossible sight. The longer we stood there, the more I felt the darkness pressing in on all sides, as if something huge and watchful hovered right outside the circle of light. The attendant finished wiping our windshield, his movements quick and nervous. Best get where you're going before the next storm hits, he advised, glancing at the sky. They're saying it'll be worse than this one. How far to the Kentucky border? My husband asked. About 40 miles, the man replied. But it'll feel longer tonight. He gave me an odd look, as if he could sense my unease. Drive safe. Don't stop for anything. The emphasis he placed on those last words sent a chill through me. Before I could question him further, he turned and hurried back to his small booth, hunching against the rain. What was that about? My husband asked as we climbed back into the car. I shook my head. I don't know, but I don't like it. We got back into the car and pulled away from the truck stop, leaving that wavering neon sign in the rear view. The fog welcomed us again, thicker than before, swallowing the road so thoroughly I had to keep the speed way down. The headlights carved out a weak tunnel of visibility, and every shape beyond that felt ominous, like it might flicker to life at any second. Not 20 minutes later, the highway curved sharply through another stretch of dense forest. My husband finally spoke up, asking why I seemed so paranoid. You've been white-knuckling the steering wheel for the past hour, he said. And you keep looking in the mirrors like you think someone's following us. I was about to give him a half-truth, blame it on the weather, the poor visibility, the treacherous road conditions when a tall, warped silhouette emerged by the edge of the tree line. It vanished almost immediately, but I caught a glimpse of something that didn't fit any known animal. Long, sinewy limb-like shapes rustling the branches as if brushing them aside. My husband glanced out his window, alerted by my sudden intake of breath, but whatever it was had melted into the shadows. I was left gripping the wheel, pulse hammering in my ears, replaying the moment. It had moved again just like before, a silent, calculated shift deeper into the woods. I pressed my foot down on the accelerator, not caring about the slick road anymore. All I wanted was distance between us and whatever lurked in those trees. Whoa, slow down, my husband urged, bracing himself against the dashboard. What's going on with you? He started to ask what I saw. I stumbled through words like, something really big might have been a tree. But they sounded ludicrous, even to me. He didn't seem convinced, though he caught on to my panic and urged me to slow down, worried I'd lose control of the car. Instead, I kept pushing forward, wanting to leave that region behind as fast as possible. There's something out there, I finally admitted, my voice barely audible over the engine's roar. I saw it twice now, something wrong. What do you mean, wrong? His tone was gentle but concerned, as if he was dealing with someone on the verge of hysteria. Maybe I was. It's enormous, I said, struggling to find words that wouldn't sound completely deranged. Shaped almost like a person, but impossibly tall. Moving through the trees like it's searching for something. He stared at me for a long moment. "You think you saw a person in the forest? In this weather?" "Not a person," I insisted. "Something else. Something that shouldn't exist." A flash of lightning illuminated the forest again, and for a split second I thought I saw it, a vertical shape moving parallel to the road, keeping pace with our car despite the distance and difficult terrain. But the darkness returned too quickly for me to be certain. "There," I gasped, pointing frantically. "Did you see it?" My husband peered into the gloom, seeing nothing but trees and fog. "I think you're overtired," he said gently. "Your eyes are playing tricks on you." "I know what I saw," I insisted, though doubt was beginning to creep in. Was I losing my mind? Hallucinating from stress and fatigue? The rational part of my brain suggested these were more likely explanations than some unknown giant stalking us through the Tennessee wilderness. But then I remembered the truck stop attendant's warning. "Don't stop for anything." He knew something. They all did, the cashier, the truckers whispering in the corner. This wasn't the first time something had been seen in these woods. A couple more miles bled into the night, and finally the Welcome to Kentucky sign shone faintly through the haze. Relief trickled in, though it never fully chased away the dread lodged in my gut. Lights became more common. Small roadside houses, the occasional gas station, traces of normal life creeping back in. Still, I couldn't forget the way that shape had loomed at the tree line. My eyes flicked to the side mirror now and then, almost expecting to see an impossibly tall figure keeping pace in the distance. Even as we left Tennessee behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed, that whatever I'd glimpsed had taken note of us, had perhaps even been drawn to our presence. "We're almost there," my husband said soothingly, mistaking my continued anxiety for simple exhaustion, "another hour at most." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. How could I explain that crossing the state line hadn't reassured me, that I still felt watched, marked in some way by whatever prowled those foggy woods? We arrived at my family's place right on the edge of dawn. Porch lamps illuminated a gravel driveway, and a sense of familiarity tried to comfort me. But as I stepped out onto the soggy ground, every rustle of leaves behind the house made me twitch. My relatives came out to greet us, calling out how they'd worried we'd get stuck in the storm. I forced a smile, pretending the only issue was the weather. Deep down, I was still replaying that moment of the second sighting on the road, feeling that it had looked right back at me, fully aware. The thought made my skin crawl. My mother embraced me, then held me at arm's length, her brow furrowing with concern. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, trying to make it sound like a joke, but not quite succeeding. "Was the drive that bad?" "Just tired," I managed, attempting a smile that felt brittle on my face. The fog was brutal. Inside, I slumped into a chair, trying to shake off the unease. My husband hovered close, sensing I wasn't just tired. The warmth of the room, the smell of coffee, and the soft chatter of my family were comforting. Yet a knot of tension clung to me. Each time a branch tapped against the window, I thought about what might be out there, looming in the dark, waiting. My father, a practical man who'd spent 40 years working in the logging industry, noticed my jumpiness. "You all right, kid?" he asked, using the nickname he'd given me when I was 8. "You look strung tight as a bow." For a moment, I considered telling him everything, about the towering figure I'd seen, about the strange behavior of the people at the truck stop, about the inexplicable feeling of being watched that still hadn't left me. But what would be the point? He'd either think I was hallucinating from exhaustion or making up stories to explain away simple road anxiety. "Just need some rest," I said instead. It was a long drive. He nodded, seemingly satisfied with this explanation, though I caught him exchanging a concerned glance with my husband when he thought I wasn't looking. My sister arrived later that morning with her 2 children. The house filled with noise and activity, providing a welcome distraction from my dark thoughts. I threw myself into family activities, helping prepare lunch, playing board games with the kids, catching up on family gossip, anything to keep my mind from drifting back to those moments on the foggy highway. But as the day wore on, I found myself repeatedly drawn to the windows, staring out at the tree line that bordered my parents' property. The weather remained dismal, with low clouds and intermittent rain shrouding the distant hills. Perfect conditions, I thought grimly, for something to hide. You keep looking outside, my husband observed quietly, coming to stand beside me as I gazed out at the dripping trees. What are you expecting to see? I shook my head, unwilling to voice my irrational fears. Nothing. Just checking if the weather's clearing up. He placed a hand on my shoulder, his touch gentle but insistent. Talk to me, he urged. Something happened on that drive. Something that scared you. I turned to face him, struggling with how to begin. How do you explain seeing something that shouldn't exist? Something that defies categorization and rational thought? I saw something in the forest, I finally admitted, keeping my voice low to avoid being overheard by the rest of the family. Twice it was huge, taller than any human could possibly be, moving through the trees like it was hunting. Instead of dismissing me outright, he studied my face with a mixture of concern and confusion. You're serious, he said. It wasn't a question. I know how it sounds, I replied, but I know what I saw. And I think the locals know about it too. The people at that truck stop, they were acting strange, like they were afraid to talk about something. The rest of the day passed in a blur of half-hearted conversation and restless pacing. Nobody else knew about the haunting images stuck in my mind. That night, when everyone turned in, I sat by the window, peeking out at the rows of trees behind my family's home. A small hope flickered that morning light might erase the fear. But something told me that what I'd encountered wasn't the kind of thing you just leave behind. It stayed with you like a secret only you and it understood. The following morning, after a night of fitful sleep punctuated by nightmares of being pursued through endless forests, I made an excuse to borrow my father's old desktop computer. While the family busied themselves with breakfast preparations, I sequestered myself in his cluttered home office and began searching in earnest. I started with local legends and folklore, tales of strange sightings in the Tennessee mountains. Most results led to typical cryptid stories. Bigfoot sightings, phantom panthers, the occasional ghost story tied to Civil War battlefields or native burial grounds. Nothing that matched what I'd seen. Expanding my search, I looked for reports of unusually tall figures seen in forests throughout the southeastern United States. This yielded more promising results. Scattered accounts from hikers, campers, and drivers describing abnormally tall, thin shapes observed at forest edges or through breaks in the trees. Many accounts mentioned heights of 10 to 15 feet, consistent with what I'd glimpsed. One forum thread caught my attention. Titled "The Watchers in the Wood," it contained dozens of testimonials from people who claimed to have seen similar entities throughout the Appalachian region. The descriptions varied somewhat, but certain details remained consistent. Extreme height, deliberate movement, and a tendency to observe rather than engage. A post from someone using the username Mountain Driver particularly resonated. Saw it 3 times now on the TNKY border routes. Always in bad weather, always at night. Keeps pace with vehicles somehow. Don't think it's hostile. More like it's studying us. Local rangers know about it but won't talk. Been happening for decades, according to my grandfather. I scrolled through more accounts, my heart racing as I recognized elements of my own experience reflected in these strangers' words. One person described how the creature seemed to step between trees like they weren't even there. Another mentioned the feeling of being analyzed, like a specimen under glass. Moving beyond amateur forums, I searched academic databases for anthropological studies of regional folklore. This led me to a paper by Dr. Amelia Winters, an ethnographer who had documented unusual folk beliefs throughout Appalachia. Buried in her work was a brief reference to what locals called the tall men, entities believed to inhabit the deepest parts of the forest, emerging only during storms or periods of heavy fog. According to Winters, these beliefs predated European settlement, with similar entities appearing in Cherokee oral traditions. The native peoples reportedly left offerings at certain trees to appease these watchers and ensure safe passage through their territories. My research was interrupted by my husband, who entered the office with a concerned expression. "Your mom sent me to find you," he said. "Breakfast is getting cold." I minimized the browser window hastily. "Sorry, lost track of time." He studied me for a moment. "More research about what you saw?" I nodded, not bothering to deny it. "There are others, you know. Other people who've seen the same thing. Dozens of them all through these mountains." He sat on the edge of the desk, his expression troubled. "I believe that you saw something," he said carefully. "I'm just not sure what to make of it." "I'm not either," I admitted. "But I need to understand it. I need to know what's out there. Just," he hesitated. "Be careful, okay? Don't get obsessed with this. Sometimes it's better not to know everything." His words stayed with me as I rejoined the family, going through the motions of normal interaction while my mind remained fixated on what I'd discovered. The idea that these entities, whatever they were, had been observed for generations somehow made my experience both more credible and more unsettling. After breakfast, I excused myself for a walk, needing fresh air and solitude to process my thoughts. The rain had finally stopped, though the sky remained overcast and threatening. I followed a path that led from my parents' backyard into the surrounding woods, aware of the irony in seeking answers in an environment so similar to where my ordeal had begun. The forest was quiet, with only the occasional drip of water from saturated leaves breaking the silence. I moved slowly, hyper-aware of my surroundings, scanning the trees for any sign of unusual movement or shapes that didn't belong. About a quarter-mile from the house, I came across an ancient oak, its massive trunk split down the middle as if struck by lightning decades ago. Something about it stopped me in my tracks. Hanging from one of the lower branches was a small cloth pouch, weathered and faded but clearly placed there deliberately. I approached cautiously, remembering Dr. Winter's mention of offerings left at certain trees. The pouch was tied with twine and appeared to contain small objects. I could feel them shift as I gently prodded the fabric. Without opening it, I carefully returned it to its position on the branch. Standing there beneath the towering oak, I felt a prickling sensation at the back of my neck, the unmistakable feeling of being watched. I turned slowly, scanning the surrounding forest, but saw nothing unusual. Just trees and underbrush and the occasional bird flitting between branches. And yet the feeling persisted. Something was observing me, I was certain of it. Whether it was the same entity I'd glimpsed on the highway, or some other forest presence, I couldn't say. But in that moment I understood on a visceral level why humans have always approached wilderness with a mixture of awe and fear. The forest isn't empty. It never has been. We're just usually too loud, too distracted, too removed from our primal instincts to notice what watches us from the shadows. The rest of our visit passed without incident, though I remained on edge, constantly scanning the tree line for unusual shapes or movement. My husband tried to distract me with family activities and reminiscences, but he could tell my mind was elsewhere. On our final night, as we packed for the return journey the following morning, he finally confronted me about it. "You're still thinking about what you saw," he said. Not an accusation, just a statement of fact. "I can't help it," I replied, folding a sweater with mechanical precision. "It's like, once you see something like that, you can't unsee it. Can't unfeel what it did to you." He sat beside me on the bed, his expression troubled. "What exactly do you think it was?" I paused, considering the question seriously. After days of research and reflection, I still had no definitive answer. "I don't know," I admitted. "Something that's been here longer than us, maybe. Something that watches from the edges of our world but rarely intersects with it." "That sounds like fantasy," he said gently. "Maybe," I conceded. "But there are too many accounts spanning too many years for all of it to be mass hallucination or misidentification. Something is out there. Something real, even if we don't have a proper framework to understand it." That night I dreamed of forests, endless expanses of ancient trees stretching in all directions. I was moving through them, not walking, but gliding, seeing the world from an impossible height. Animals scattered at my approach, sensing something other than human. In the dream, I understood what it was to be ancient and patient, to observe the brief, frantic lives of humans with detached curiosity. I woke before dawn, the dream still vivid in my mind. Rain pattered against the window, a gentle reminder that our journey home would likely face the same challenging conditions as our arrival. Strangely, the thought didn't fill me with the same dread it might have days earlier. We set out after an early breakfast. My family's concerns about the weather met with reassurances that we'd be careful. The fog hung low over the landscape as we pulled away from the house, reducing the familiar surroundings to ghostly outlines. My husband took the first driving shift, allowing me to stare out at the passing scenery, lost in thought. As we approached the Tennessee border, I felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a return of that strange, electric tension I'd experienced days earlier. The forest seemed denser here, older somehow, the trees pressing closer to the road as if reaching for the passing cars. "We can take a different route," my husband offered, noticing my increased vigilance. "Add a couple hours, but avoid the mountain pass." I considered it briefly before shaking my head. "No, I need to go back the same way. I need to, I don't know, face it, I guess." He nodded, understanding without fully understanding. As we crossed into Tennessee, the rain intensified, sheets of water cascading over the windshield faster than the wipers could clear it. The road wound upward into the mountains, visibility reduced to mere yards ahead. "I'll take over," I said when we stopped for gas at a small station just off the highway. My husband seemed relieved, perhaps sensing that this was something I needed to do. Back behind the wheel, I felt an odd calm settle over me as we approached the stretch of road where I'd had my first sighting. The forest loomed dark and impenetrable on either side, but the panic that had gripped me before was absent. In its place was a strange sort of acceptance, not of danger, but of mystery. The fog parted briefly as we rounded a familiar curve, revealing the same dense stand of trees where I'd first glimpsed the towering figure. I slowed slightly, eyes scanning the tree line with deliberate care. For several long moments there was nothing but stillness and silence. Then at the very edge of the forest a movement caught my eye. Not frantic or threatening, but slow and purposeful. A vertical shape, impossibly tall, partially obscured by branches but unmistakably present. It stood motionless as if acknowledging my return, before receding back into the depths of the woods with that same fluid grace I remembered. My husband, focused on adjusting the heating, missed it entirely. I didn't alert him. This moment felt personal somehow, a silent communication between myself and whatever ancient presence inhabited these mountains. "Everything okay?" he asked, noticing my changed expression. "Yes," I said, surprised to find I meant it. "Everything's fine." As we continued our journey, the forest watching silently as we passed, I realized that some fears don't disappear, they transform. What had terrified me days earlier now filled me with a complex mixture of awe and humility. The world is vaster and stranger than we allow ourselves to believe, with mysteries that persist despite our best efforts to categorize and explain. I may never understand exactly what dwells in those foggy Tennessee woods. Perhaps it's better that way. Some things are meant to be glimpsed rather than known, brief intersections with the inexplicable that remind us how narrow our perspective truly is. The highway stretched before us, leading back to the familiar comforts of home and routine, but I knew I would carry this experience with me, this brushing against something ancient and other. And on future drives through similar landscapes, I would find myself watching the spaces between trees with new awareness, half afraid and half hoping to catch another glimpse of what watches us from the edges of our world. The understanding I'd reached wasn't about answers but about questions, about being comfortable with not knowing, with accepting that some mysteries resist resolution, and somehow that felt like enough. The GPS had stopped working about 20 miles back, but I was too stubborn to admit we were lost. My girlfriend sat in the passenger seat, map spread across her lap, while our friend occupied the back seat with camping gear piled around her. We had planned this trip for months, desperate to escape the suffocating routine of city life. The main campground at Pine Lake had been our destination, but when we finally arrived after dark, every decent spot was occupied by families with massive RVs and generators humming through the night. "There has to be something further out," I muttered, squinting at the poorly lit campground directory. A park ranger, grizzled and weathered like he had spent decades in these woods, ambled over to our car. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness as he leaned down to my window. "Y'all looking for a place to pitch?" His voice carried the weight of too many late nights dealing with frustrated campers. When I nodded, he scratched his beard thoughtfully. "There's a primitive site about 3 miles down the old logging road. Most folks avoid it because there's no facilities, but it's free and quiet." He paused, studying our faces in the dim light. Real quiet. The way he emphasized those words should have been our first warning. Instead, I thanked him and followed his directions, turning onto a narrow dirt path that seemed to disappear into the forest. The headlights illuminated gnarled branches that scraped against the car windows, creating an unsettling symphony of scratches and groans. My girlfriend's fingers drummed nervously against the door handle. "This feels like the beginning of every horror movie ever made," our friend joked from the back seat, but her laughter sounded forced. The deeper we drove into the woods, the more the jokes faded into uncomfortable silence. The trees grew denser, their canopy blocking out even the faintest starlight. Our headlights seemed pathetically inadequate against the consuming darkness. After what felt like an eternity, we reached a small clearing barely large enough for our car and 2 tents. The moment I turned off the engine, the silence crashed over us like a physical weight. No distant highway noise, no other campers, no night sounds that typically populate a forest. Just absolute, oppressive quiet that made my ears ring. We sat in the car for several minutes, none of us eager to step outside. The headlights created a small bubble of illumination that only emphasized how thoroughly darkness surrounded us. Beyond that weak circle of light, anything could be watching, waiting, calculating our next move. Unloading our gear took twice as long as usual because we kept startling each other. Every rustle of fabric or clank of metal stakes sounded magnified in the stillness. My phone's flashlight provided barely enough illumination to see our hands, let alone properly set up camp. We worked in nervous whispers, as if speaking too loudly might attract unwanted attention from whatever lived in these woods. The ground beneath our feet felt wrong somehow, softer than it should be, with an odd springiness that suggested we were walking on layers of decomposing organic matter accumulated over decades. When I knelt to hammer in tent stakes, the soil gave way easily, releasing an earthy smell tinged with something else.
Something vaguely sweet and nauseating. My girlfriend struggled with her portion of the tent, her movements jerky with anxiety.
"This place gives me the creeps," she whispered, glancing repeatedly at the tree line. "Why do you think that ranger recommended it? If it's so great, why isn't anyone else here?" Our friend had gone unusually quiet, focused intently on her own tent setup. When I asked if she was okay, she just nodded and continued working. But I noticed her hands shaking as she threaded the tent poles. The beam of her flashlight kept wandering toward the forest, as if she expected to see something moving between the trees. Once both tents were finally erected, we attempted to build a fire. The kindling we had brought seemed reluctant to catch, and even when flames finally took hold, they burned lower and dimmer than they should have. The fire cast dancing shadows that made the surrounding trees appear to shift and sway, creating the illusion of movement where there should have been stillness. We cooked hot dogs over the weak flames, but none of us had much appetite. The food tasted like ash, and every few minutes one of us would stop chewing to listen for sounds that never came. The silence pressed against our eardrums, making normal conversation feel forced and artificial. Even our laughter seemed to be absorbed by the darkness before it could properly echo. As we sat around the dying fire, our friend finally spoke about what had been bothering her. "I've been camping in these mountains my whole life," she said, staring into the flames. "But I've never been anywhere that felt this empty. It's like the forest is holding its breath, waiting for something to happen." Her words settled over us like a cold blanket, and I found myself scanning the darkness beyond our pitiful circle of light. The trees stood motionless, their branches creating intricate patterns against the star-filled sky, but something about their stillness felt deliberate, watchful. We retreated to our tents around 11 o'clock, though none of us felt particularly tired. The adrenaline of anxiety had kept us all wide awake and hyper-alert. My girlfriend and I squeezed into our 2-person tent, while our friend settled into her smaller shelter about 10 feet away. Before zipping up for the night, I conducted one final sweep of the area with my flashlight, checking for anything out of place. The beam revealed nothing unusual, just our car parked at the edge of the clearing and the dark wall of trees surrounding us on all sides. Yet something felt fundamentally wrong about the scene. The shadows seemed too deep, too complete, as if they were actively consuming light rather than simply existing in its absence. Inside the tent, we whispered to each other for nearly an hour, neither wanting to be the first to fall asleep. My girlfriend had brought a small battery-powered lantern, which we kept on its dimmest setting, creating a warm amber glow inside our nylon shelter. The light was comforting, but it also made us acutely aware of how thin the tent walls were, how little protection they actually provided. Sometime around midnight, I was finally drifting off when a sound cut through the silence like a blade. It started as a low moan, barely audible, then gradually rose in pitch and volume until it became a wailing cry that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The sound was neither human nor animal, but something in between, something that spoke to a primal fear buried deep in human DNA. My girlfriend's fingernails dug into my arm as we both lay perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. The cry continued for what felt like minutes, rising and falling in waves, echoing off the trees and returning to us altered, distorted. When it finally faded, the silence that followed was even more oppressive than before. "What the hell was that?" my girlfriend whispered, her voice barely audible. I had no answer. In 25 years of camping and hiking, I had never heard anything remotely similar. It was too structured to be wind, too sustained to be a bird, too haunting to be any normal forest creature. The sound had seemed to come from the darkness itself, as if the night had found its voice and decided to announce its presence. We lay awake for another hour, straining our ears for any repeat performance, but heard nothing. Eventually, exhaustion overcame fear, and we both fell into restless sleep, our dreams filled with shadowy figures and echoing cries that followed us through twisted landscapes of our subconscious minds. Woke around 2:30 in the morning to the sound of careful footsteps circling our campsite. The steps were deliberate and measured, crunching softly on the gravel and fallen leaves with the rhythm of someone trying to move quietly, but not quite succeeding. My first thought was that our friend had gotten up for a bathroom break, but as I listened more carefully, the footsteps seemed too heavy, too purposeful. The sound moved in a wide circle around both tents, pausing occasionally as if the walker was studying something, then continuing its slow circuit. I counted the steps, trying to gauge the size and gait of whatever was out there. The pattern suggested someone or something much larger than our petite friend, moving with the confidence of someone familiar with navigating in complete darkness. My girlfriend stirred beside me, her breathing changing as she fought her way back to consciousness. When she realized I was awake and listening, she pressed close to me, her body tense with fear. Together we tracked the footsteps as they completed another full circle of our camp, never venturing close enough to touch the tents but never straying far enough to disappear entirely. "Should we check on her?" my girlfriend whispered so quietly I had to strain to hear her. Before I could answer, we heard our friend's voice from her tent, also whispering. "Are you guys awake? There's someone walking around out there." Her voice carried a tremor of barely controlled panic. The footsteps stopped immediately, as if the walker had heard our whispered conversation and was now listening to us as intently as we were listening to it. The silence stretched out for several minutes, during which none of us dared to speak or move. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard I was certain it could be heard outside the tent. Just when I was beginning to think the danger had passed, the footsteps resumed. But now they moved differently. Instead of the previous methodical circling, they approached our tent directly, each step deliberate and heavy. The sound grew closer and closer until I was certain the walker was standing just outside our tent wall, close enough to touch the fabric if they reached out their hand. We held our breath, waiting for what would come next. Part of me expected to see the tent wall push inward as someone pressed against it, or to hear the zipper being slowly pulled open. Instead, after what felt like an eternity, the footsteps retreated, moving away from our campsite and disappearing into the forest. The silence that followed was so complete, it felt like we had imagined the entire encounter. Around 4 in the morning, a strange light began filtering through the tent walls. At first I thought dawn was breaking early, which would have been a tremendous relief. The idea of surviving until daylight had become my primary focus, and any sign of approaching morning felt like salvation. But when I checked my phone, the screen showed 4:17 a.m., far too early for sunrise in late September. The light was wrong anyway, too pale and diffuse to be natural sunlight. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, creating an odd, flat illumination that made the tent walls glow with an eerie luminescence. My girlfriend noticed it too, and we both lay there staring at the strange radiance that surrounded us. "What is that?" she whispered, her voice tight with confusion and fear. I had no explanation. The light was bright enough to see by, but when I peered through a gap in the tent zipper, the forest outside appeared to be in complete darkness. It was as if the light existed only within our tent, or perhaps only in our perception. The contradiction made my head spin and my stomach churn with a mixture of anxiety and vertigo. Our friend called out softly from her tent, confirming that she was seeing the same phenomenon. Her voice sounded small and frightened, like a child afraid of monsters under the bed. The three of us were trapped in this bubble of impossible light, surrounded by a darkness that seemed more absolute than any natural night. The false dawn lasted for nearly an hour, during which none of us could fall back asleep. We whispered back and forth, trying to rationalize what we were experiencing, but every explanation sounded more ridiculous than the last. Gas leak from our camp stove causing hallucinations, reflection from some distant light source, mass hysteria brought on by isolation and fear. Nothing made sense, and the longer the light persisted, the more unsettling it became. There was something deeply wrong about light that existed without a source, illumination that defied the basic laws of physics and perception. It felt like a violation of natural order, a sign that we had stumbled into a place where normal rules no longer applied. When the light finally faded around 5:15, the darkness that replaced it seemed twice as thick and oppressive as before. The transition was gradual, like a dimmer switch being slowly turned down, until we were once again surrounded by the absolute blackness of deep forest night. Just as I was finally drifting back toward sleep, something pressed down hard on the lower portion of my sleeping bag, right where my feet were positioned. The pressure was firm and deliberate, as if someone was kneeling on the tent floor and leaning their weight against my legs. The fabric of the tent bent inward, creating a distinct depression that I could both see and feel. Terror shot through my nervous system like electricity, jolting me fully awake and triggering every survival instinct I possessed. Without thinking, I began thrashing and screaming, my voice raw and primal in the confines of the small tent. The sound was barely recognizable as human, more like the cry of a wounded animal fighting for its life. My girlfriend jerked awake beside me, confused and frightened by my sudden explosion of panic. She grabbed at my arms, trying to calm me down, but I continued to struggle against the invisible presence pressing down on my feet. The tent shook violently with my movements, the aluminum poles bending and creaking under the stress. "Stop! Stop!" my girlfriend hissed, her voice urgent with fear and confusion. "What's wrong? What's happening?" But I could not stop. The pressure on my feet felt real and immediate, a tangible threat that my panicked mind interpreted as an attack. I kicked and twisted, trying to free myself from whatever was holding me down, my breathing coming in sharp, desperate gasps that fogged the air inside the tent. After what felt like hours but was probably only 30 or 40 seconds, the pressure suddenly released. The tent walls sprang back to their normal position and I found myself free to move. I lay there panting, my heart racing so fast I thought it might burst, while my girlfriend stared at me with wide, frightened eyes. There was something on my feet, I gasped, trying to explain what had happened, something heavy pressing down. But even as I said the words, they sounded insane. How could something press down on my feet from outside the tent without leaving any evidence? How could a physical presence simply vanish without a trace? Our friend called out from her tent, her voice shaky with concern. She had heard my screaming and wanted to know if we were okay. The idea that my terror had been loud enough to wake her made me feel exposed and vulnerable, as if I had announced our location to every dangerous thing in the forest. We whispered back and forth through the tent walls, trying to piece together what had happened, but none of us had answers that made sense. The incident felt simultaneously real and impossible, like something from a nightmare that had somehow bled into waking reality. Despite our fear, we could not simply lie in our tents pretending nothing had happened. The need to understand what was going on finally overcame our terror, and I made the decision to venture outside and investigate. My girlfriend begged me not to leave the tent, but I could not shake the feeling that remaining passive was somehow more dangerous than taking action. I unzipped the tent flap with trembling fingers, the sound unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing the familiar outline of our campsite. But everything looked different now, more sinister and threatening. The shadows seemed deeper, the spaces between objects more mysterious and concealing. I crawled out of the tent slowly, every muscle in my body coiled and ready to bolt back inside at the first sign of danger. The ground around our tent showed no evidence of disturbance, no footprints or compressed areas where someone might have knelt or crouched. The absence of physical evidence made the experience feel even more unsettling, as if reality itself had become unreliable. Our friend emerged from her tent at the same time, her flashlight beam joining mine in scanning the area. Together we conducted a thorough search of the campsite, looking for any sign of what had caused the pressure on my feet or the footsteps we had heard earlier. We examined every inch of ground, every nearby tree, every possible hiding spot where someone or something might have concealed itself. We found nothing. No tracks, no disturbed vegetation, no physical evidence that anyone had been in our campsite except for us. The discovery was both relieving and terrifying. If there was no intruder, then what had we experienced? Were we all losing our minds simultaneously, falling victim to some form of mass hysteria brought on by isolation and fear? "This place is wrong," our friend said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need to leave. Now." Looking around at the dark trees that surrounded us, their branches reaching toward our small circle of light like grasping fingers, I could not disagree. Whatever was happening here defied rational explanation, but our fear was real enough. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to pack up and get out while we still could. My girlfriend poked her head out of the tent, her face pale in the flashlight beam. "Please," she said, "let's just go. I can't take any more of this." We broke camp in record time, fueled by adrenaline and a desperate need to escape whatever had claimed this patch of wilderness. Working by flashlight, we stuffed sleeping bags and collapsed tents with frantic efficiency, not bothering with the careful packing we had done on arrival. Every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat. Every sound made us freeze and listen for approaching danger. The car had never looked so welcoming as it did in those pre-dawn hours, its familiar bulk representing safety and normalcy. In a world that had become alien and hostile, we threw our gear into the trunk and back seat without organization, our only goal to get everything loaded and get moving as quickly as possible. As I started the engine, the headlights illuminated the campsite one final time. In that brief moment before we drove away, I could have sworn I saw movement in the tree line just at the edge of the light's reach, something tall and dark that seemed to shift and withdraw the moment the headlights touched it. But when I looked more carefully, there was nothing there but trees and shadows. We drove in silence down the narrow dirt road, none of us willing to speak until we reached the main highway. The familiar sight of pavement and road signs felt like crossing back into the real world after spending time in some alternate dimension where normal rules did not apply. Only when we were safely surrounded by streetlights and the distant glow of civilization did we finally begin to breathe normally again. Miles later, sitting in a 24-hour diner with coffee growing cold in our hands, we tried to make sense of what had happened. The fluorescent lights and plastic booth seats felt wonderfully mundane after our night in the woods, but the memory of that place lingered like a bad taste. "We all experienced the same things," our friend said, stirring sugar into her coffee with shaking hands. "The sounds, the light, the feeling of being watched. That has to mean something." I nodded, but I was not sure what it meant. Mass hallucination seemed impossible, but so did everything else we had experienced. The rational part of my mind kept searching for logical explanations, while a deeper, more primitive part simply wanted to forget the whole experience and never return to those woods. Even now, months later, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night feeling that same pressure on my feet, hearing those deliberate footsteps circling just outside my bedroom. The memory of that place has lodged itself deep in my consciousness, a reminder that there are still corners of the world where humans are not welcome, where ancient forces hold sway over the darkness and the silence. We never went back to find out what we had encountered in those woods. Some questions, I have learned, are better left unanswered. Some places are meant to remain empty, avoided by those wise enough to recognize danger when they feel it pressing down on them in the dark hours before dawn.